Welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight we descend deeper into the archives, where thousands of police reports rest in perfect order. Each one a careful translation of chaos into comprehension. Let yourself settle into the rhythm of documentation, the steady pulse of recorded truth. The morning shift had ended hours ago, leaving behind the particular silence that settled over police stations during the transition between day and night. In the records division, fluorescent lights hummed their eternal song over rows of filing. Cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling, each drawer containing hundreds of reports typed on forms that had remained unchanged for decades. Detective Michael Torres found himself drawn to these archives on nights when sleep eluded him, when the weight of current cases made rest impossible and he needed the comfort of completed stories. Problems that had been solved and filed away. With the methodical precision that characterized police work at its most fundamental level. Tonight, he had chosen Section K, reports filed during the winter months of 1988, a period when the city had experienced what statisticians would later describe as an unusually high number of property crimes. The first file he pulled contained Incident Report 882847, filed by Officer Patricia Winters on a Tuesday morning in February. The form was filled out in the careful block letters that officers of that era had been trained to use, each letter formed with the deliberate precision that ensured legibility decades later. The report concerned a burglary at 1247 Oak Street. The residence of Harold and Mary Fitzgerald, both retired teachers who had returned from their weekly grocery shopping to find their front door standing open and their living room in disarray. Officer Winters had arrived at the scene at 10:47 a.m., according to the timestamp at the top of the report. Her documentation began with the standard observations required by department protocol. Weather conditions, clear and cold. Approximate. Temperature, 32 degrees. Visibility, excellent. Traffic conditions on Oak Street, light. These details, seemingly mundane, created a precise snapshot of the moment, when order had been disrupted and the process of restoration had begun. The narrative section of the report unfolded with the methodical thoroughness that characterized Officer Winters' approach to documentation. She had entered the residence through the front door, which showed signs of forced entry consistent with the use of a pry bar or similar tool. Scratches on the doorframe indicated that the intruder had worked quickly but not carelessly, suggesting some familiarity with the techniques required to breach a locked door without creating excessive noise. Inside the residence, Officer Winters had documented the scene with the kind of detail that transformed a chaotic moment into a comprehensible sequence of events. The living room had been searched, but not ransacked. Furniture had been moved. Rather than overturned, drawers had been opened and their contents examined rather than simply dumped onto the floor. The intruder had shown a level of care that suggested either respect for the residents or concern about creating evidence that might aid in identification. Officer Winters had noted that the television, stereo system, and other obvious electronics had been left untouched. Instead, the intruder had focused on less obvious items, a small collection of silver spoons that had belonged to Mrs. Fitzgerald's grandmother, a jewelry box containing pieces that were valuable more for their sentimental significance than their monetary worth, and a manila envelope that had contained approximately $300 in cash that the Fitzgeralds kept for emergencies. The report continued with interviews conducted at the scene. Harold Fitzgerald, age 67, had provided a detailed inventory of the missing items, speaking with the precision of someone accustomed to organizing information for students. He had noted that the burglar had ignored a valuable camera sitting in plain sight on the kitchen counter, but had taken the time to locate and open a small safe hidden behind books in their bedroom closet. Mary Fitzgerald, age 64, had observed that several photograph albums had been disturbed, as if someone had been looking through them. This detail had struck Officer Winters as significant enough to document with particular care. The albums contained family photographs dating back several decades, pictures of children and grandchildren, vacation trips, and holiday celebrations. Mrs. Fitzgerald could not determine whether any photographs had been taken, but she was certain that the albums had been examined. The physical evidence section of the report documented Officer Winter's systematic examination of the crime scene. She had found partial fingerprints on the bedroom safe, footprints in the soft earth outside the back door, and fibers caught on the damaged front door frame. Each piece of evidence had been photographed, measured, and collected according to department procedures, creating a scientific record that could be analyzed by specialists trained in forensic techniques. Officer Winters had also documented the condition of the neighborhood during her investigation. She had spoken with Mrs. Chun, who lived across the street and had noticed an unfamiliar van parked on Oak Street earlier that morning. The van had been there when Mrs. Chun left for her morning walk, but was gone when she returned an hour later. She had not thought to note the license plate number, but remembered that the van was white with what appeared to be commercial lettering on the side. The report included a detailed diagram of the Fitzgerald residence, showing the points of entry and exit, the rooms that had been searched, and the locations where evidence had been found. Officer Winters had drawn this diagram by hand, using the careful drafting skills that officers of that era had been required to master before the widespread adoption of digital photography and computer-generated crime scene documentation. In the follow-up section, Officer Winters documented her canvass of the neighborhood, conducted over the following 2 days. She had spoken with residents of every house within a 4-block radius of the Fitzgerald home, asking about unusual activity, unfamiliar vehicles, and anything else that might provide leads for further investigation. Most of these conversations had yielded nothing significant, but Officer Winters had documented each one with the same thoroughness, understanding that patterns sometimes emerged only when apparently unrelated observations were viewed together. Mr. Rodriguez, who lived 2 blocks away, had mentioned seeing a white van in his neighborhood several days earlier. The van had been parked outside the Henderson residence while Mrs. Henderson was at work, and Mr. Rodriguez had assumed it belonged to a repair service or contractor. However, he had not seen anyone enter or leave the house during the time the van was present. Mrs. Thompson, who worked as a volunteer at the senior center, had heard from several elderly residents about suspicious phone calls they had received in recent weeks. The callers had identified themselves as representatives of various organizations, asking questions about the residents' daily schedules, family members who lived out of town, and whether they lived alone. Mrs. Thompson had assumed these were sales calls or attempts to gather information for charitable solicitations. But in light of the Fitzgerald burglary, she wondered whether they might be connected to someone gathering intelligence for criminal purposes. Officer Winters had documented each of these seemingly unrelated pieces of information with the same careful attention to detail. Her report created a comprehensive picture, not just of the specific crime that had occurred at the Fitzgerald residence, but of the broader pattern of suspicious activity that might be affecting the entire neighborhood. The case file contained additional reports filed over the following weeks as the investigation progressed. Detective Lisa Park had been assigned to follow up on the leads developed by Officer Winters, and her reports documented the methodical process of transforming observations into actionable intelligence. Detective Park had contacted local pawn shops and second-hand dealers, providing detailed descriptions of the items stolen from the Fitzgerald home. This process had required visits to more than 20 businesses, each documented with its own brief report noting the proprietor's name, the date and time of the visit, and any relevant information obtained during the conversation. The breakthrough had come from Riverside Pawn, where the owner, Samuel Morrison, had recognized the description of Mrs. Fitzgerald's silver spoons. A young woman had attempted to sell similar items 2 days after the burglary, but Morrison had become suspicious when she was unable to answer basic questions about the piece's history or provenance. He had declined to purchase the items, and had made note of the woman's description and the license plate number of the car she was driving. Detective Park's report documented the careful process of following this lead. The license plate had been registered to Angela Martinez, age 23, who lived in an apartment complex on the south side of town. A check of Martinez's background had revealed no prior arrests, but her boyfriend, Robert Kim, had a record of minor property crimes dating back to his teenage years. The arrest had been made without incident at Martinez's apartment, where Detective Park had found not only the items stolen from the Fitzgerald home but also property that appeared to be connected to several other recent burglaries. Martinez and Kim had been operating what Detective Park described as a sophisticated information-gathering operation, using phone calls to identify potential targets and conducting surveillance to determine the best times for break-ins. The case file contained detailed inventories of all the recovered property, cross-referenced with reports from other burglary victims who had been contacted as the investigation expanded. Detective Park had documented the return of each item to its rightful owner, including photographs of emotional reunions between victims and their recovered possessions. Harold and Mary Fitzgerald had been particularly grateful for the return of the silver spoons, which had been passed down through 3 generations of Mrs. Fitzgerald's family. The elderly couple had invited Detective Park to join them for coffee when she returned their belongings, a gesture that she had documented in her final report as an example of the personal connections that made police work meaningful beyond its technical aspects. Detective Torres pulled another file, this one containing reports from a series of incidents that had occurred during the spring of 1988. The first report, filed by Officer James Chun, documented a vandalism case at Roosevelt Elementary School, where someone had broken several windows and spray-painted graffiti on the building's exterior walls. Officer Chun's report began with the standard preliminary observations, date and time of discovery, weather conditions, and the identity of the person who had reported the damage. The school's principal, Dr. Margaret Foster, had arrived at work on Monday morning to find that 3 classroom windows had been broken and several inappropriate words had been painted on the wall near the main entrance. The documentation of the damage was methodical and precise. Officer Chun had measured each broken window, photographed the graffiti from multiple angles, and collected samples of the glass for potential forensic analysis. He had noted that the windows had been broken from the outside using what appeared to be rocks or similar projectiles, and that the graffiti had been applied using black spray paint of a type commonly available at hardware stores and automotive supply shops. Officer Chun's investigation had expanded beyond the immediate crime scene to include the surrounding neighborhood. He had documented the school's location relative to nearby residential areas, noting potential routes that vandals might have used to approach and leave the building undetected. The school was situated at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by houses whose residents might have heard the sounds of breaking glass if the vandalism had occurred during evening hours when people were likely to be at home. The canvass of the neighborhood had been conducted with the same thoroughness that characterized Officer Chun's approach to the physical evidence. He had spoken with residents of every house within hearing distance of the school, asking about unusual noises, unfamiliar vehicles, or groups of young people who might have been in the area during the previous weekend. Mrs. Sullivan, who lived directly across from the school, had heard what she thought might have been firecrackers on Saturday evening around 11 p.m. She had looked out her window but had not seen anyone in the schoolyard. Mr. Jackson, whose house backed up to the school's playground, had noticed that his dog had been unusually restless on Saturday night, barking intermittently until well after midnight. These observations, documented in Officer Chun's report with careful attention to timing and detail, had provided a foundation for understanding when the vandalism had likely occurred and what methods they perpetrators had used to avoid detection. The report also included Officer Chen's assessment of the graffiti itself, noting that the words and symbols suggested the work of teenagers rather than adults, and that the application appeared hasty and unplanned rather than carefully executed. The follow-up investigation had been assigned to Detective Sarah Williams, whose reports documented the patient process of identifying the young people responsible for the vandalism. Rather than focusing solely on the criminal aspects of the case, Detective Williams had approached the investigation as an opportunity to understand the underlying causes that might lead teenagers to damage their own school. Detective Williams had begun by meeting with Dr. Foster and several teachers to discuss recent tensions or conflicts within the school community. The conversations, documented in detailed interview reports, had revealed that the spring semester had been marked by budget cuts that had eliminated several popular programs, including the art club and after-school sports activities that had previously provided constructive outlets for student energy and creativity. The investigation had also uncovered concerns about a group of students who had been struggling academically and socially. Young people who felt disconnected from the school community and resentful about what they perceived as unfair treatment by teachers and administrators. Detective Williams had documented these conversations with sensitivity to the confidential nature of educational records while still gathering information that might be relevant to solving the vandalism case. The breakthrough had come not through traditional detective work, but through community engagement. Detective Williams had attended a school board meeting where parents and students were discussing the impact of budget cuts on school programs. During this meeting, several students had spoken passionately about their frustration with the elimination of activities that had been important to them. After the meeting, Detective Williams had been approached by Maria Santos, a 16-year-old student who had been president of the disbanded art club. Maria had not been directly involved in the vandalism, but she knew who was responsible and was willing to share information if it could be used to help rather than simply punish the students involved. The conversation with Maria, documented in Detective Williams' report with careful attention to protecting the confidentiality of juvenile sources, had revealed that the vandalism had been carried out by 3 students who had been members of the art club before its elimination. They had viewed their actions not as random destruction, but as a form of protest against what they saw as the school administration's lack of respect for student interests and needs. Detective Williams had approached the resolution of the case with the same thoughtfulness that had characterized her investigation. Rather than simply pursuing criminal charges, she had worked with Dr. Foster and the students' parents to develop a response that addressed both the need for accountability and the underlying issues that had motivated the vandalism. The 3 students involved had been required to pay for the damage they had caused and to perform community service hours at the school. More importantly, they had been invited to work with Dr. Foster and parent volunteers to develop a proposal for restoring some of the eliminated programs through fundraising and community support. The case file contained follow-up reports documenting the success of this approach. The students had not only completed their community service requirements but had become leaders in the effort to restore extracurricular activities. Their fundraising efforts had been successful, enough to restart the art club and to provide partial funding for after-school sports programs. Detective Williams' final report had noted that the vandalism incident had ultimately served as a catalyst for improved communication between students, parents, and school administration. The process of addressing the underlying causes of the students' frustration had created opportunities for ongoing dialogue about how to maintain school programs and student engagement despite budget constraints. Detective Torres found himself Impressed by the comprehensive approach that Detective Williams had brought to what could have been treated as a simple vandalism case, her willingness to look beyond the immediate crime to understand its social and educational context had transformed a potentially destructive incident into an opportunity for community building and problem solving. Next file contained reports from a domestic violence case that had required multiple interventions over several months. The initial report, filed by Officer Lisa Park, documented a call to 847 Elm Street, where neighbors had reported sounds of an argument that included breaking glass and what appeared to be physical altercation. Officer Park's report began with her observation that domestic violence calls required special sensitivity and careful documentation, both to ensure the safety of all parties involved and to create records that might be needed for legal proceedings. Her approach to the case reflected the training that officers of that era had received in recognizing the complex dynamics that characterized abusive relationships. The initial response had involved separating the parties, David and Jennifer Morrison, to allow for individual interviews that might reveal information that would not be shared in the presence of the other party. Officer Park had documented these conversations with careful attention to both the immediate safety concerns and the longer-term patterns of behavior that might indicate ongoing abuse. Jennifer Morrison, age 29, had initially denied that any physical altercation had occurred, attributing the sounds that neighbors had heard to an accident involving a dropped dish. However, Officer Park had observed facial bruising that appeared fresh and defensive wounds on Mrs. Morrison's hands, and arms that suggested she had been protecting herself from physical attack. David Morrison, age 32, had been cooperative with Officer Park's questions, but had shown signs of intoxication and had difficulty providing a coherent account of the evening's events. He had acknowledged that he and his wife had been arguing about financial problems, but had denied any physical violence, claiming that his wife had injured herself when she tripped while cleaning up broken dishes. Officer Park's report documented the physical evidence at the scene, including the pattern of broken glass, furniture that had been displaced during the altercation, and blood stains that appeared to be consistent with the injuries observed on Mrs. Morrison. She had also noted the presence of empty beer bottles and the strong smell of alcohol throughout the apartment. The immediate resolution had involved David Morrison spending the night at his brother's house while Jennifer Morrison remained in the apartment with instructions to contact police if her husband attempted to return before the following morning. Officer Park had provided Mrs. Morrison with information about domestic violence resources and had scheduled a follow-up visit for the next day. The case file contained multiple follow-up reports documenting Officer Park's ongoing involvement with the Morrison family over the following months. The second report, filed 3 days later, described Officer Park's return visit to check on Mrs. Morrison's safety and to provide additional information about legal options and support services. During this visit, Mrs. Morrison had been more forthcoming about the history of abuse in her relationship, describing a pattern of escalating violence that had begun shortly after her husband lost his job 6 months earlier. She had explained that David had been drinking more heavily and had become increasingly angry and violent, particularly when discussing their financial difficulties. Officer Park had documented Mrs. Morrison's account with sensitivity to the emotional difficulty of discussing traumatic experiences, while also gathering information that might be needed for legal proceedings. The report included details about previous incidents that had not been reported to police, as well as Mrs. Morrison's concerns about the safety of their 2 young children, who had been staying with her mother since the night of the reported incident. The follow-up Investigation had revealed that David Morrison had been struggling with alcohol dependence since losing his job, and that the family's financial situation had deteriorated to the point where they were facing eviction from their apartment. Officer Park had documented these underlying stressors while making it clear that they did not excuse or justify the domestic violence that had occurred. Resolution of the case had involved multiple agencies and resources working together to address both the immediate safety concerns and the underlying problems that had contributed to the violence. David Morrison had been required to attend alcohol treatment and anger management programs, while Jennifer Morrison had been connected with counseling services and legal assistance to help her understand her options for protecting herself and her children. Officer Park's final report, filed 6 months after the initial incident, documented the positive outcomes that had resulted from this comprehensive approach. David Morrison had successfully completed his treatment programs and had found new employment, while Jennifer Morrison had gained the confidence and resources necessary to establish clear boundaries about acceptable behavior in their relationship. Case file included letters from both parties expressing gratitude for Officer Park's patient and professional handling of their situation. They had credited her willingness to look beyond the immediate crisis to address underlying causes, with helping them rebuild their relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and shared responsibility for maintaining a safe and healthy home environment. Detective Torres pulled another file, this one dealing with a series of check fraud cases that had occurred during the summer of 1988. The investigating officer, Detective Robert Kim, had documented each incident with the methodical attention to detail that financial crimes required, creating a comprehensive record of what had initially appeared to be isolated incidents but eventually revealed itself as an organized scheme. The first report in the series documented a complaint filed by Margaret Chun, a local business owner who had discovered that someone had altered a check she had written to a supplier, changing the amount from $53 to $530. Mrs. Chun had noticed the discrepancy when reviewing her monthly bank statement, observing that the altered check had caused her account to be overdrawn and had resulted in additional fees from her bank. Detective Kim's report documented the technical aspects of the alteration with scientific precision. The original check had been modified using what appeared to be a chemical solvent that had removed the original ink without damaging the paper, allowing new numbers to be written in their place. The alteration had been skillfully done, using ink that closely matched the original in handwriting that mimicked Mrs. Chun's natural style. Investigation had expanded when Detective Kim discovered that several other local businesses had reported similar incidents during the same time period. Each case involved checks that had been intercepted after being mailed, but before reaching their intended recipients, modified to increase the amounts, and then cashed at different banks throughout the metropolitan area. Detective Kim had documented the pattern that emerged from analyzing these cases together. The perpetrator appeared to be intercepting mail from specific businesses, selecting checks that were written for amounts small enough that significant increases would not immediately trigger suspicion from bank tellers. The alterations were being made using sophisticated techniques that suggested specialized knowledge of document modification methods. The breakthrough in the case had come through Detective Kim's collaboration with postal inspectors, who had been investigating reports of mail theft from several business districts. The joint investigation had revealed that someone had been stealing mail from collection boxes using duplicated keys, sorting through the stolen mail to identify checks that could be profitably altered. The arrest had been made when postal inspectors observed Thomas Rodriguez, a former bank employee, using unauthorized keys to access mail collection boxes in the downtown business district. Detective Kim's report documented the search of Rodriguez's apartment, where investigators had found sophisticated equipment for chemical document alteration, dozens of stolen checks in various stages of modification, and detailed records of the amounts that had been successfully obtained through the scheme. The case file contained complete documentation of the restitution process, as Detective Kim had worked with each victim to ensure that stolen funds were recovered and that any bank fees or other costs associated with the fraud were addressed. The reports demonstrated the patient attention to detail required to restore order after financial crimes, including coordination with multiple banks, insurance companies, and other institutions that had been affected by the scheme. Rodriguez had eventually pleaded guilty to charges of mail theft and check fraud, receiving a sentence that included both imprisonment and restitution to his victims. Detective Kim's final report noted that the case had led to improved security measures for mail, collection boxes, and enhanced training for bank employees in recognizing altered documents. The archives contained dozens of similar cases, each one documented with the same methodical thoroughness that characterized police work of that era. Detective Torres found himself drawn to these reports, not just for their historical interest, but for the insights they provided into the fundamental nature of police work. The patient attention to detail that transformed chaotic incidents into comprehensible narratives. He pulled one more file before ending his evening in the archives. This one containing reports from a missing person case that had tested the resources and patience of the entire department. The subject was Timothy Walsh, a 14-year-old boy who had disappeared on his way home from school on a Friday afternoon in October 1988. The initial report, filed by Officer Maria Santos, documented the response to a call from Timothy's mother, who had become concerned when her son failed to arrive home at his usual time. Mrs. Walsh had explained that Timothy was an exceptionally reliable boy who always called if he was going to be late, and that his failure to come home or contact her was completely out of character. Officer Santos had begun the investigation by documenting Timothy's normal routine, creating a detailed timeline of his activities on the day he disappeared. Timothy had attended all his classes at Lincoln Middle School, had eaten lunch with his usual group of friends, and had been seen leaving the school building at 3:15 p.m., the normal dismissal time. The boy's route home took him through Riverside Park, a well-maintained area with good lighting and regular foot traffic from other students and neighborhood residents. Officer Santos had walked this route herself, documenting potential places where Timothy might have stopped or where someone might have approached him without being observed by other pedestrians. The initial search had involved officers canvassing the entire route between the school and Timothy's home, speaking with anyone who might have been in the area during the relevant time period. Officer Santos had documented each of these conversations, creating a comprehensive record of Timothy's movements and any unusual activity that had been observed in the neighborhood. The case file contained reports from dozens of additional officers who had joined the search as it expanded throughout the weekend. Detective Captain James Morrison had coordinated the effort, organizing teams to search the park, nearby wooded areas, and abandoned buildings where a missing child might have sought shelter or been taken against his will. The investigation had revealed that Timothy was a popular and well-adjusted student with no history of running away or engaging in risky behavior. His teachers described him as responsible and academically successful, while his friends insisted that he had not mentioned any plans to go anywhere other than directly home after school. Detective Morrison's reports documented the systematic expansion of the search to include neighboring communities and the involvement of specialized units trained in missing person cases involving children. The investigation had consumed enormous resources, with more than 50 officers participating in various aspects of the search and investigation. The resolution had come after 4 days of intensive searching, when Timothy was found in a basement storage room of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. He had been held by Marcus Williams, a 28-year-old man with a history of mental illness, who had become convinced that Timothy was his son from a previous relationship that existed only in his delusions. Detective Morrison's report documented the careful process of Timothy's rescue, which had been conducted with special attention to minimizing additional trauma to the boy. Williams had been arrested without resistance, apparently relieved to have his fantasy relationship with Timothy officially acknowledged by authorities, even though that acknowledgement took the form of criminal charges. The case file contained detailed documentation of Timothy's medical and psychological evaluation following his rescue, as well as the ongoing support provided to his family during the recovery process. Detective Morrison had coordinated with social services and mental health professionals to ensure that Timothy received appropriate care and that his parents had access to resources for helping their son process the traumatic experience. The final reports in the case documented the prosecution of Marcus Williams, who had been found competent to stand trial but had received a sentence that emphasized treatment for his mental illness rather than purely punitive measures. Detective Morrison had noted in his concluding report that the case had highlighted the importance of community awareness about mental health issues and the need for better systems to identify and assist people whose psychological problems might lead them to commit crimes against children. Timothy Walsh had eventually recovered fully from his ordeal, returning to school and resuming his normal activities with the support of counselors and the close attention of teachers and friends who had been deeply affected by his disappearance. Detective Morrison had included follow-up reports documenting Timothy's progress over the following year, noting that the boy had shown remarkable resilience and that his family had become advocates for improved mental health services in their community. Detective Torres closed the final file and sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of all the stories he had absorbed during his hours in the archives. These reports represented more than just documentation of police work. They were records of human resilience, examples of how communities could come together to solve problems and support those who had been affected by crime and trauma. The methodical thoroughness that characterized these reports reflected not just professional competence but genuine care for the people whose lives had been disrupted by the incidents under investigation. Officers like Santos, Morrison, Kim, and Williams had understood that their job was not simply to process cases, but to restore order and safety to communities that had been affected by crime. As he returned the files to their proper places and prepared to leave the archives, Detective Torres felt a renewed appreciation for the fundamental importance of careful documentation in police work. These reports would outlast the officers who had written them, preserving not just the facts of specific cases, but the wisdom and humanity that had guided their resolution. The city above continued its restless movement through the night, generating new incidents that would require the same patient attention to detail, the same careful documentation, the same commitment to understanding the human complexities that lay beneath the surface of every police report. But down in the archives, these older stories rested in their files, holding their lessons with quiet dignity, waiting for the next reader who needed to understand that effective police work was fundamentally about serving people and communities with patience, skill, and genuine care. The sub-basement of the Central Records Division existed in a state of perpetual twilight, illuminated only by the occasional fluorescent fixture that cast pools of pale light across endless rows of filing cabinets. Detective Rachel Foster had discovered this forgotten realm during her third year with the department, when a routine search for background materials had led her down a staircase she had never noticed before, into corridors that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of the building above. Here, in cabinets that bore the patina of decades, rested the oldest files in the department's collection. Cases from the 1970s and early 1980s, documented on forms that had been typed on manual typewriters. Their ribbon impressions now faded to a ghostly gray that required careful attention to decipher. These were the archives of the archives, the deepest layer of institutional memory, where the most distant echoes of the city's past waited in patient silence. Tonight, Detective Foster found herself drawn to cabinet section M7, where files from 1979 rested in manila folders that had grown brittle with age. The first file she withdrew bore the case number 793421, typed on a label that had yellowed to the color of old parchment. Inside, she found reports that transported her to a different era of police work, a time when investigations unfolded at a more deliberate pace and documentation was created with fountain pens and careful handwriting. The case concerned the theft of rare books from the municipal library, a crime that had puzzled investigators for months before revealing connections that stretched far beyond the initial incident. Detective Harold Morrison, whose careful script filled page after page of lined report forms, had approached the investigation with the methodical patience that characterized police work. Before the advent of computerized databases and instant communication, the theft had been discovered on a Tuesday morning in March, when librarian Elizabeth Chun had arrived to find that someone had gained access to the rare books collection housed in the library's climate-controlled vault. The break-in had been executed with unusual sophistication, involving the manipulation of both electronic locks and mechanical security systems that should have made unauthorized entry virtually impossible. Detective Morrison's initial report documented the crime scene with the kind of detailed observation that reflected the investigative techniques of that era. He had spent hours in the vault, cataloging not just what had been taken, but what had been left behind, noting the specific books that the thief had chosen and the careful way in which remaining volumes had been repositioned to disguise the extent of the theft. The stolen items included first editions of local historical works, rare maps of the city's early development, and a collection of manuscripts that had been donated by prominent families whose ancestors had played important roles in the region's founding. Detective Morrison had noted that the thief appeared to have specialized knowledge of the collection, selecting items based not on their obvious monetary value but on their historical significance and rarity. The investigation had required Detective Morrison to immerse himself in the world of rare book collectors, antique dealers, and academic researchers who might have both the knowledge to identify valuable items and the connections necessary to dispose of stolen materials. His reports documented visits to dozens of bookshops, galleries, and private collectors, each conversation carefully recorded in the flowing handwriting that characterized formal police documentation of that era. Asterisk. The breakthrough had come through Detective Morrison's patient cultivation of relationships within the rare book community. A dealer in antiquarian maps had mentioned a customer who had been asking unusually specific questions about the provenance of local historical materials, particularly items that might have come from institutional collections rather than private estates. This lead had eventually connected to Professor Martin Whitfield, a respected historian at the local university who had been conducting research on the city's early development. Professor Whitfield had been granted access to the library's rare book collection for his academic work and had used this legitimate access to study the security systems and identify the most valuable items in the collection. Detective Morrison's reports documented the careful process of building a case against Professor Whitfield, a task complicated by the suspect's reputation and the need to distinguish between legitimate scholarly interest and criminal intent. The investigation had required consultation with experts in academic ethics, library security, and the rare book trade, creating a comprehensive understanding of how such thefts could occur and be prevented. The resolution had been handled with sensitivity to Professor Whitfield's position and the impact that criminal charges would have on his career and reputation. Detective Morrison had worked with university officials and the district, attorney's office to develop an approach that ensured the return of stolen materials while recognizing the complex motivations that had led a respected scholar to commit theft. Professor Whitfield had ultimately pleaded guilty to the charges and had cooperated fully in returning all stolen items. His sentence had included restitution to the library for security, improvements and community service that involved cataloging historical materials for other public institutions. Detective Morrison's final report had noted that the case had led to enhanced security, measures at the library, and improved protocols for granting access to rare materials. Detective Foster found herself fascinated by the thoroughness and humanity that had characterized Detective Morrison's approach to the case. His investigation had required not just technical police skills, but deep understanding of academic culture, rare book markets, and the psychological pressures that might lead an otherwise honest person to commit theft. The documentation reflected a level of patience and intellectual curiosity that seemed to belong to a different era of law enforcement. She pulled another file from the same period, this one dealing with a series of art thefts from private residences throughout the city's most affluent neighborhoods. The investigating officer, Detective Susan Williams, had documented each incident with the careful attention to detail that art crimes required, creating comprehensive records of stolen pieces, their estimated values, and the specific techniques used to remove them from their owners' homes. The first theft had occurred at the residence of Margaret and Charles Thompson, a retired couple who had spent decades collecting contemporary paintings and sculptures. The thief had gained entry through a basement window, had disabled the home's security system with apparent expert knowledge, and had removed 3 paintings that represented the most valuable pieces in the Thompson collection. Detective Williams had noted that the thief had shown sophisticated understanding of the art market, selecting pieces that were valuable but not so famous that they would be difficult to sell. The stolen paintings were significant enough to command high prices from collectors, but not well known enough to be immediately recognizable to most dealers or auction houses. The pattern had become clear as additional thefts occurred over the following months. Each break-in had targeted homes belonging to serious art collectors, and each had involved the theft of pieces that suggested insider knowledge of the local art scene. The thief was not simply grabbing whatever looked valuable, but was making informed choices based on detailed understanding of specific collections and market values. Detective Williams had approached the investigation by immersing herself in the city's art community, attending gallery openings, auction previews, and collector gatherings where she could observe the social dynamics and business relationships that characterized the local art scene. Her reports documented these activities with the same systematic attention that other officers might bring to surveillance of suspected drug dealers or organized crime figures. The investigation had revealed a complex network of relationships among collectors, dealers, gallery owners, and artists that provided numerous opportunities for someone with access to information about private collections. Detective Williams had documented the various ways that people learned about valuable artworks in private homes, from insurance appraisals to social media posts to casual conversations at art-related events. The solution to the case had emerged through Detective Williams' patient observation of auction house activities. She had noticed that several pieces similar to those stolen from local collectors had appeared at auctions in other cities, sold by a dealer who specialized in contemporary art, but had no obvious connection to the original owners. This dealer, Robert Chun, had been operating what Detective Williams described as a sophisticated laundering operation, working with accomplices who provided information about valuable collections and who had the technical skills necessary to defeat residential security systems. Chun had been using his legitimate business as cover for disposing of stolen artworks through auction houses that did not always conduct thorough provenance research. The arrest had required coordination with law enforcement agencies in multiple cities where stolen artworks had been sold. Detective Williams had worked with art recovery specialists and insurance investigators to identify stolen pieces and trace them back to their original owners. The process had taken more than a year to complete, requiring patient documentation and legal coordination across multiple jurisdictions. The recovery of stolen artworks had been complicated by the fact that some pieces had been sold to innocent purchasers who had bought them in good faith from seemingly legitimate dealers. Detective Williams had worked with legal experts and insurance companies to develop solutions that protected the rights of theft victims while minimizing harm to collectors who had unknowingly purchased stolen items. The case file contained photographs of the recovered artworks being returned to their original owners, moments of emotional reunion between collectors and pieces that represented years of careful acquisition and deep personal attachment. Detective Williams had documented these returns with sensitivity to the personal significance that art held for its owners, recognizing that the theft had involved not just financial loss, but violation of deeply held aesthetic and emotional investments. Robert Chun had eventually been sentenced to several years in prison and had been required to pay substantial restitution to his victims. The case had led to improved communication between law enforcement agencies and the art trade, including enhanced protocols for verifying the provenance of valuable pieces offered for sale at auction houses and galleries. Detective Foster pulled another file, this one considerably thicker than the others, dealing with a complex embezzlement case that had unfolded over several years before being discovered and investigated. The case involved Patricia Morrison, a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company, who had been systematically stealing money through a sophisticated scheme that had gone undetected for nearly 5 years. The discovery of the embezzlement had been almost accidental, occurring when the company's owner, David Rodriguez, had noticed discrepancies in tax documents that didn't match his understanding of the business's financial performance. The initial investigation, conducted by Detective Thomas Kim, had revealed that Morrison had been manipulating the company's books to hide her theft of more than $200,000 over the period of her employment. Detective Kim's reports documented the painstaking process of reconstructing the financial records to determine exactly how much money had been stolen and what techniques Morrison had used to conceal her activities. The investigation had required consultation with forensic accountants and auditing specialists who could analyze complex financial documents and identify subtle manipulations that might not be obvious to investigators without specialized training. Morrison had been creating false vendor accounts and writing checks to these fictitious companies, then depositing the money into personal accounts that she had opened using variations of her name. She had also been manipulating payroll records to give herself unauthorized raises and bonuses, and had been stealing cash payments from customers by creating false entries that made it appear that these payments had been applied to customer accounts when they had actually been diverted to her personal use. The investigation had been complicated by Morrison's sophisticated understanding of the company's accounting systems and her access to all financial records. She had been able to manipulate multiple aspects of the book simultaneously, creating a web of false entries that had hidden her theft from routine auditing and review processes. Detective Kim had documented the personal circumstances that had motivated Morrison's crimes, including medical bills for her husband's cancer treatment that had created financial pressures beyond the family's ability to manage through legitimate means. While these circumstances did not excuse her theft, they provided context that helped explain how an otherwise honest employee might have begun embezzling and how small initial thefts might have escalated into a major crime. The resolution of the case had involved Morrison's full cooperation in reconstructing the financial records and identifying all accounts and assets that contained stolen money. She had pleaded guilty to the charges and had worked with investigators to ensure that as much money as possible could be recovered and returned to the company. Case file contained documentation of the restitution process, which had involved the sale of Morrison's house and other assets to partially compensate Rodriguez for his losses. Morrison had also been sentenced to several years in prison, but the judge had taken into account her cooperation and the medical circumstances that had contributed to her crimes. Rodriguez had submitted a victim impact statement that Detective Kim had included in the case file, describing the devastating effect that the embezzlement had had on his small business and his employees. The theft had forced him to lay off several workers and had nearly driven the company into bankruptcy. Effects that extended far beyond the immediate financial loss to impact the entire community that depended on the business for employment. The case had led to improved financial controls at the company and had served as a cautionary example for other small business owners about the importance of implementing adequate oversight of financial operations. Detective Kim's final report had included recommendations for preventing similar thefts, emphasizing the need for separation of duties and regular independent auditing, even in small organizations where such measures might seem unnecessary. Detective Foster found herself struck by the human complexity revealed in these old cases, the way that individual circumstances and social pressures could lead people to make choices that ultimately harmed not just their immediate victims but entire communities. The officers who had investigated these crimes had understood that their job involved not just determining guilt or innocence but understanding the broader context in which crimes occurred. She pulled another file, this one dealing with a missing person case that had challenged investigators' patience and resourcefulness. The subject was Maria Santos, a 45-year-old nurse who had disappeared from her apartment without explanation, leaving behind no indication of where she might have gone or why she might have chosen to leave. The initial report, filed by Detective Lisa Park, documented the response to a missing person report filed by Santos's supervisor at the hospital where she worked. Santos had failed to report for her scheduled shift and had not called to explain her absence, behavior that her colleagues described as completely out of character for someone known for exceptional reliability and professionalism. Detective Park had begun the investigation by conducting a thorough search of Santos's apartment, looking for clues about her state of mind or plans that might explain her disappearance. The apartment was neat and organized, with no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Santos's clothing, personal belongings, and identification documents were all in their normal places, suggesting that she had not planned an extended absence. The investigation had expanded to include Santos's friends, family members, and colleagues, all of whom described her as stable, responsible, and deeply committed to her work and personal relationships. Detective Park had documented dozens of interviews, creating a comprehensive picture of Santos's life and the people who might have information about her whereabouts. The search had revealed that Santos had been under significant stress in the months before her disappearance, dealing with the recent death of her mother and financial pressures related to medical bills and funeral expenses. However, friends and family insisted that while Santos had been grieving, she had not shown signs of depression or desperation that might suggest self-harm or a decision to abandon her life. Detective Park's investigation had included coordination with hospitals, morgues, and law enforcement agencies throughout the region, as well as consultation with mental health professionals who might provide insights into Santos's psychological state. The case had consumed enormous resources, with multiple officers participating in searches of parks, wooded areas, and other locations where someone might go to harm themselves or hide from personal problems. The breakthrough had come after 3 weeks of intensive searching, when Santos was found living under an assumed name in a shelter for homeless women in a city 200 miles away. She had been suffering from what doctors describe as a dissociative episode triggered by the accumulated stress of her mother's illness and death, during which she had lost memory of her identity and previous life. Detective Parks reports documented the careful process of Santos's identification and the gradual restoration of her memory through medical treatment and psychological counseling. The case had required coordination with medical professionals and social workers who specialized in treating trauma-related psychological conditions. Santos had eventually returned to her job at the hospital, where her colleagues had welcomed her back with understanding and support for the medical leave she needed to complete her recovery. Detective Park had included follow-up reports documenting Santos's successful return to her normal life and her gratitude for the thorough search that had led to her being found and receiving appropriate medical care. Case file contained letters from Santos's family and colleagues expressing appreciation for Detective Park's persistence and professionalism during the investigation. The thorough search had demonstrated the department's commitment to finding missing persons regardless of the time and resources required, and had provided reassurance to the community that law enforcement would make every effort to locate people who disappeared under unexplained circumstances. Detective Foster pulled one final file from Cabinet M7, this one dealing with a series of burglaries that had occurred in the historic district during the summer of 1979. The investigating officer, Detective James Morrison, had documented each incident with particular attention to the historical significance of the targeted buildings and the specialized knowledge that the crimes had required. The burglaries had all occurred in buildings dating from the covered 19th century, structures that had been converted to apartments and small businesses but that retained many of their original architectural features. The thief had been targeting specific items related to the building's historical character, including original hardware, decorative elements, and architectural details that had added value to collectors of period items. Detective Morrison had recognized that the crimes required someone with specialized knowledge of historical architecture and access to information about which buildings contained the most valuable original features. The investigation had led him into the world of historic preservation, antique dealing, and architectural salvage, where he had discovered a thriving market for authentic period items removed from old buildings. The case had been solved when Detective Morrison connected the thefts to Marcus Chun, a contractor who specialized in historic renovations and who had legitimate access to many of the targeted buildings. Chun had been using his professional activities as cover for stealing valuable architectural elements, which he had been selling to collectors and dealers who did not ask detailed questions about provenance. The investigation had revealed that Chun had been operating his theft ring for several years, targeting buildings throughout the region and working with a network of dealers who specialized in selling salvaged architectural materials. Detective Morrison had worked with historic preservation organizations and law enforcement agencies in other cities to identify stolen items and return them to their original locations when possible. The case had led to improved security measures at historic buildings and enhanced awareness among preservation professionals about the need to protect valuable architectural elements from theft. Detective Morrison's thorough documentation had also contributed to the Fasafasandukoku Achivavakam development of databases that tracked original architectural features and helped identify stolen items when they appeared in the antique trade. Detective Foster closed the final file and sat in the quiet contemplation that these old archives always inspired. The cases documented in these yellowed folders represented more than just police work. They were windows into different eras of the city's life, moments when individual choices and social pressures had intersected with law enforcement in ways that revealed fundamental truths about human nature and community life. The officers who had worked these cases had operated without many of the technological tools that modern investigators took for granted, relying instead on patient observation, careful documentation, and deep understanding of the social contexts in which crimes occurred. Their reports reflected not just professional competence, but genuine curiosity about the human stories that lay behind criminal activities. As she returned the files to their proper places in Cabinet M7, Detective Foster felt a profound connection to these earlier investigators whose work had been preserved in these archives. Their commitment to thorough documentation and thoughtful analysis had created a resource that continued to provide insights and inspiration for contemporary law enforcement, demonstrating that the fundamental skills of police work transcended any particular era or technological environment. The sub-basement around her seemed to hold thousands of similar stories, each file representing a moment when order had been restored to a community disrupted by crime, when patient investigation had revealed truth and enabled justice. These archives were more than just storage spaces. They were repositories of institutional wisdom, collections of human experience that spoke to the enduring importance of careful, thoughtful police work. The city above continued its restless movement through the night, generating new incidents that would require the same patient attention to detail, the same careful documentation, the same commitment to understanding the complex human circumstances that lay behind every criminal act. But down in the deepest archives, these older stories rested in their files, holding their lessons with quiet dignity, waiting for the next reader who needed to understand that effective police work was fundamentally about serving people and communities with patience, skill, and genuine care for the preservation of social order and human dignity. Detective Foster switched off the desk lamp and made her way back through the corridors of filing cabinets, past rows of cases that stretched back through decades of the city's history. Each file represented a fragment of human experience, a moment when someone's life had intersected with the criminal justice system, and when dedicated officers had worked to restore order and safety to their community. The elevator carried her back to the main building, where the night shift continued its quiet vigil over the city's current concerns. But she carried with her the knowledge contained in those old files, the understanding that police work at its best was a continuous conversation between past and present, an ongoing effort to learn from experience and apply that learning to the challenges that each new day would bring. The old courthouse on 5th Street stood like a monument to patience, its limestone facade weathered by decades of weather, but still solid, still purposeful in its quiet dignity. Detective Anna Reyes found herself drawn to this building during the quiet hours between shifts, when the daytime bustle of legal proceedings had given way to the contemplative silence that settled over places where important decisions were made with careful deliberation. The building dated from 1952, constructed in the solid, unadorned style that characterized public architecture of that era. Its corridors stretched in straight lines beneath high ceilings, creating spaces that seemed designed to encourage reflection and measured thought. During the day, these halls filled with the purposeful movement of attorneys, clerks, defendants, and families whose lives had intersected with the legal system in ways both profound and routine. But at night, when the courtrooms stood empty and the administrative offices were locked, the building revealed a different character. The marble floors, polished smooth by decades of footsteps, reflected the soft glow of security lighting that cast everything in muted tones of gray and amber. The wooden benches in the corridors, worn smooth by countless hours of waiting, set in patient rows like pews in a cathedral of justice. Detective Reyes walked slowly through Corridor B, where the felony courtrooms were located. Her footsteps echoed softly in the vast space, a rhythmic sound that seemed to blend with the building's own quiet breathing, the subtle creaks and sighs of an old structure settling into its nighttime rest. She had testified in these courtrooms dozens of times over her 15-year career, but she found them most compelling when they were empty, when their purpose could be contemplated without The immediate pressure of ongoing legal proceedings. Courtroom 4B had been the site of many significant trials. During her tenure with the department, the room was larger than most people expected, with seating for nearly 200 spectators arranged in neat rows, facing the raised platform where the judge's bench commanded attention and respect. The jury box sat to one side, 12 empty chairs that had held thousands of citizens over the decades, each one called to participate in the fundamental act of determining truth and assigning responsibility. Detective Reyes entered the courtroom through the heavy oak doors that closed with the solid finality that seemed appropriate for a space dedicated to resolving disputes and determining consequences. The room was illuminated only by emergency lighting, creating an atmosphere of solemn contemplation that invited reflection on the serious business that was conducted here. During regular hours, she made her way to the witness stand, a simple wooden chair positioned beside the judge's bench, where she had spent hundreds of hours over the years, providing testimony in cases that had originated with her investigations. The view from this position encompassed the entire courtroom, from the defense and prosecution tables to the gallery where families and reporters observed the proceedings that would determine the fates of people whose lives had become entangled with the criminal justice system. From this vantage point, Detective Reyes could recall dozens of specific cases that had been resolved in this room. The Morrison embezzlement trial, where Patricia Morrison had sat at the defense table with the resigned dignity of someone who had accepted responsibility for her actions and was prepared to face the consequences. The Chun art theft case, where the defense attorney had argued eloquently but unsuccessfully that his client's sophisticated knowledge of the art market should be considered a mitigating factor rather than evidence of premeditation. Asterisk. Each trial had its own rhythm and character, shaped by the personalities of the attorneys, the nature of the evidence, and the particular circumstances that had brought defendants into conflict with the law. But all of them shared certain fundamental elements: the careful presentation of evidence, the methodical examination of witnesses, the deliberate process through which complex human situations were reduced to questions that could be answered with legal certainty. Detective Reyes remembered testifying in the Santos missing person case, where the unusual circumstances of Maria Santos's disappearance had required careful explanation to help the jury understand the medical and psychological factors that had contributed to her temporary loss of memory and identity. The prosecutor had worked patiently to establish that Santos had been a victim of her own medical condition rather than someone who had deliberately abandoned her responsibilities, a distinction that had important implications for insurance claims and employment protections. The defense attorney in that case had raised questions about the thoroughness of the police investigation, suggesting that more could have been done to locate Santos more quickly. Detective Reyes had spent hours on the witness stand describing the systematic search procedures that had been followed, the coordination with other law enforcement agencies, and the consultation with medical experts who had provided guidance about the likely behavior of someone experiencing the dissociative episode. The trial had concluded with a finding that Santos's disappearance had been involuntary, a result of medical circumstances beyond her control. This conclusion had protected her employment rights and had ensured that insurance companies could not deny claims related to the medical treatment she had needed upon her return. Detective Reyes had felt deep satisfaction in knowing that her thorough investigation had contributed to a resolution that recognized the complex realities of Santos's situation. She moved from the witness stand to the jury box, settling into one of the chairs where citizens had deliberated on the cases she had investigated. The view from here was different, focused primarily on the witness stand and the attorney's tables, designed to help jurors concentrate on the evidence being presented rather than being distracted by the emotional reactions of Spectators in the gallery. From this perspective, Detective Reyes could imagine the discussions that had taken place among jurors as they worked to understand the cases she had brought before them. The careful review of evidence, the weighing of testimony, the sometimes lengthy deliberations required to reach verdicts that would satisfy the demanding standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. She remembered waiting for the jury's decision in the Whitfield rare book theft case, where the defendant's reputation as a respected academic had created sympathy among some jurors who found it difficult to believe that a professor could commit theft for personal gain. The deliberations had lasted 3 days, with the jury requesting to review testimony about Professor Whitfield's financial situation and the specific techniques he had used to defeat the library security systems. The eventual guilty verdict had been accompanied by a recommendation for leniency, reflecting the jury's recognition that Whitfield's crimes had been motivated by genuine financial desperation rather than simple greed. The judge had incorporated this recommendation into a sentence that emphasized restitution and community service rather than extended imprisonment, a resolution that had satisfied both the need for accountability and the full recognition of mitigating circumstances. Detective Reyes left the jury box and walked to the defense table, where she had observed dozens of defendants as they faced the consequences of their actions. This simple wooden table had been the focal point for human dramas that ranged from tragic to redemptive, where people confronted the reality of how their choices had affected others and what price they would be required to pay for those choices. She could recall the particular posture of different defendants as they sat at this table during their trials. Patricia Morrison had maintained the composed dignity of someone who had accepted responsibility for her embezzlement and was focused on making whatever amends were possible. Robert Chun had seemed genuinely surprised by the extent of the network that investigators had uncovered around his art theft operation, as if he had never fully considered how his actions affected not just immediate victims, but entire communities of collectors and dealers. Marcus Chun, the contractor who had stolen architectural elements from historic buildings, had shown a different kind of reaction during his trial. He had seemed to view his prosecution as a personal attack on his professional reputation rather than a natural consequence of criminal behavior. His defense had focused on arguing that the items he had taken were not really stolen because the building's owners had not specifically valued or protected them, an argument that the jury had found unconvincing, but that had revealed interesting questions about how society valued its architectural heritage. The prosecution table held its own memories for Detective Reyes as the place where district attorneys had organized the evidence from her investigations into coherent narratives that could be understood by juries and judges. She had worked with dozens of prosecutors over the years, learning to appreciate the skill required to transform complex police investigations into clear legal arguments that respected both the rights of defendants and the interests of victims and society. She remembered working with Assistant District Attorney Sarah Williams on the Santos case, where the unusual medical circumstances had required extensive consultation with experts in neurology and psychology. Williams had spent weeks preparing to present testimony that would help the jury understand how trauma could affect memory and behavior in ways that might seem impossible to people who had never experienced such conditions. The collaboration between police, investigators, and prosecutors had always been one of the aspects of law enforcement that Detective Reyes found most intellectually satisfying. The process of taking evidence gathered during investigations and organizing it into legal arguments required a different kind of thinking than police work itself, a more formal and systematic approach that complemented the intuitive and observational skills that characterized good detective work. She left the courtroom and walked down the corridor to the holding area, where defendants waited before and during their court appearances. This space was more utilitarian than the courtroom itself, with simple wooden benches and basic security features, designed to ensure safety while maintaining the dignity appropriate for people who had not yet been convicted of crimes. The holding area had its own atmosphere of quiet contemplation, a place where people waited for their cases to be called, often spending hours in nervous anticipation of proceedings that would determine significant aspects of their futures. Detective Reyes had occasionally observed defendants in this space, noting how differently people responded to the stress of facing criminal charges. Some defendants, particularly those who were facing charges for the first time, showed obvious anxiety and confusion about the legal process. Others, who had previous experience with the criminal justice system, displayed a more resigned acceptance of the procedures they would face. A few seemed genuinely relieved to finally have their cases come to trial, viewing the proceedings as an opportunity to tell their side of the story and perhaps receive sentences that would allow them to begin rebuilding their lives. She recalled observing Timothy Rodriguez, the check fraud defendant, as he waited for his sentencing hearing. Rodriguez had pleaded guilty to the charges and had cooperated fully with investigators in developing a restitution plan that would compensate his victims. He had spent his time in the holding area reading what appeared to be financial planning materials, apparently preparing for the challenging process of rebuilding his credit and reputation after completing his sentence. The holding area also contained a small interview room where attorneys met with their clients to discuss strategy and prepare for court appearances. Detective Reyes had occasionally been asked to participate in these meetings when defense attorneys wanted to clarify details about the investigations that had led to their clients' arrests. These conversations had provided valuable insights into how defense attorneys approached cases that originated with police investigations. Many defense lawyers were genuinely interested in understanding the investigative process, not to find technical flaws that might benefit their clients, but to better comprehend the human circumstances that had led to criminal charges. She remembered a particularly thoughtful conversation with defense attorney Michael Park, who had represented Marcus Chin in the architectural theft case. Park had been interested in understanding how Detective Morrison had developed the specialized knowledge necessary to investigate crimes involving historic buildings and architectural artifacts. The discussion had led to productive exchanges about how law enforcement officers could better understand the communities and markets that surrounded different types of criminal activity. Detective Reyes left the holding area and climbed the stairs to the second floor, where the civil courtrooms were located. While these rooms were not directly involved in criminal cases, they handled many matters that arose from criminal activities: restitution hearings, civil lawsuits filed by crime victims, and family law cases that sometimes resulted from the disruption that criminal charges could create in people's lives. Courtroom 2 had been the site of several restitution hearings related to cases she had investigated. These proceedings focused on determining exactly how much money defendants owed to their victims and establishing payment schedules that would allow for compensation while recognizing the financial realities that defendants would face after completing their sentences. She recalled the restitution hearing for Patricia Morrison, where the court had worked to balance the legitimate claims of her former employer against Morrison's limited ability to pay while supporting her family and rebuilding her life after prison. The process had required careful documentation of Morrison's assets, income potential, and family obligations, creating a realistic plan that provided meaningful compensation to the victim while avoiding requirements that would make successful reintegration impossible. The civil court had also handled a lawsuit filed by several victims of the art theft ring, who had sought compensation beyond what criminal restitution could provide. The case had raised complex questions about insurance coverage, the responsibilities of auction houses in verifying provenance, and the rights of innocent purchasers who had unknowingly bought stolen artwork. Detective Reyes remembered testifying in this civil proceeding, where the standard of proof was different from criminal cases, but where the same factual questions about the theft and laundering operations had to be examined in detail. The civil case had ultimately been settled out of court, with insurance companies and auction houses agreeing to provide compensation that allowed victims to replace stolen artwork with comparable pieces. The second floor also contained the law library, a quiet space filled with legal references and case law that attorneys used to research arguments and precedents. Detective Reyes occasionally visited this library to better understand how courts had handled similar cases in other jurisdictions, information that sometimes proved useful in developing investigation strategies or preparing testimony. The library's atmosphere of scholarly concentration provided a different perspective on the legal system than the more dramatic environment of courtrooms. Here, the law revealed itself as an ongoing conversation among judges, attorneys, and scholars about how society should respond to conflict and wrongdoing. The books and journals represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about justice, punishment, and the complex relationship between individual rights and community obligations. She spent a few minutes reading recent case law related to financial crimes, noting how courts in other states had handled cases similar to the Morrison embezzlement investigation. The legal precedent suggested that courts were becoming more sophisticated in their understanding of the psychological and social factors that could contribute to white-collar crimes, particularly those involving defendants who had no previous criminal history. Detective Reyes left the library and walked to the administrative offices, where court clerks and other staff members managed the paperwork and scheduling that kept the legal system functioning. These offices were locked at night, but she could imagine the quiet efficiency that characterized their daytime operations. The careful filing and recording that ensured that every case received proper attention and that all legal requirements were met. The administrative aspect of the court system had always impressed Detective Reyes with its attention to detail and its commitment to maintaining accurate records. Every hearing, every filing, every decision was documented with care that ensured accountability and provided resources for appeals and future reference. This documentation created an institutional memory that paralleled the archives maintained by the police department, preserving the collective wisdom that emerged from the ongoing process of administering justice. She made her way to the third floor, where the judges' chambers were located. These private offices were where judges reviewed cases, researched legal questions, and wrote the decisions that shaped how laws were interpreted and applied. The chambers were not open to public access, but Detective Reyes had occasionally been invited to meet with judges who wanted to better understand the investigative techniques and community policing approaches that characterized modern law enforcement. These conversations had been among the most intellectually stimulating aspects of her career, providing opportunities to discuss the broader implications of police work and its relationship to the legal system. Judges brought a different perspective to questions about crime and justice, one shaped by their responsibility for ensuring that legal proceedings were fair and that sentences were appropriate for both the crimes committed and the individuals who committed them. She remembered a particularly thoughtful conversation with Judge Margaret Foster, who had presided over several of the cases arising from Detective Reyes's investigations. Judge Foster had been interested in understanding how community policing approaches might influence the types of cases that came before her court and whether different investigative techniques might lead to resolutions that better served both victims and defendants. The discussion had touched on fundamental questions about the purpose of the criminal justice system, whether it should focus primarily on punishment and deterrence, or whether it should emphasize rehabilitation and restoration. Judge Foster had noted that her experience suggested that the most successful outcomes often resulted from approaches that combined accountability with genuine efforts to address the underlying causes of criminal behavior. Detective Reyes left the judge's chambers area and walked to the building's central staircase, a grand marble structure that connected all 4 floors of the courthouse. The staircase was wide enough to accommodate the crowds that filled the building during busy court days, but at night it created a cathedral-like space that seemed designed for contemplation and reflection. Standing at the base of the staircase, Detective Reyes could look up through the open center to the building's skylight, which during the day filled the entire structure with natural light. At night, the skylight revealed only darkness, but the architectural effect created a sense of aspiration and transcendence that seemed appropriate for a building dedicated to the pursuit of justice. The courthouse represented something important about how society chose to address conflict and wrongdoing, rather than simply responding to crime with immediate retribution. The community had created this elaborate institutional structure designed to ensure that responses to criminal behavior were measured, fair, and based on careful consideration of evidence and circumstances. Detective Reyes had seen how this system worked in practice through her involvement in dozens of cases that had moved from investigation through prosecution to resolution. The process was often slow and sometimes frustrating, but it provided opportunities for reflection and correction that immediate responses to crime could not offer. She thought about the defendants whose cases had brought them to this building, and how the legal process had affected their lives and the lives of their victims. Patricia Morrison had emerged from her encounter with the criminal justice system as someone who understood the consequences of her actions and was committed to making amends. Professor Whitfield had used his community service sentence as an opportunity to contribute his expertise to historical preservation efforts that benefited the entire community. Even Robert Chun, despite his initial resistance to accepting responsibility for his art theft activities, had eventually acknowledged the harm his actions had caused to collectors and institutions throughout the region. His cooperation with investigators had led to the recovery of artwork that might otherwise have been lost forever, and his knowledge of art theft techniques had contributed to improved security measures at galleries and auction houses. The courthouse building itself seemed to embody the patience and deliberation that characterized the legal system at its best. Its solid construction suggested permanence and stability, while its classical proportions created an atmosphere of dignity and respect for the serious business conducted within its walls. Detective Reyes walked through the building's main lobby, where large windows looked out onto the city streets where the crime she investigated had occurred. The view reminded her of the connection between the courthouse and the community it served. The way that the abstract principles of justice were applied to specific situations, involving real people whose lives had been affected by criminal activity. The lobby also contained several memorial plaques honoring judges, attorneys, and court staff who had contributed to the administration of justice over the decades since the building's construction. These memorials provided reminders that the legal system was sustained by the dedication of individuals who had chosen to devote their careers to public service, often at personal sacrifice and always with awareness of the important responsibilities they carried. As she prepared to leave the courthouse, Detective Reyes felt a renewed appreciation for the complex institutional framework that transformed her investigations into opportunities for justice and resolution. The building and the people who worked within it represented society's commitment to responding to crime in ways that respected both the rights of individuals and the needs of communities for safety and order. The night air was cool as she stepped outside, but the courthouse behind her remained illuminated by security lighting that would keep its presence visible throughout the hours of darkness. Tomorrow would bring new court proceedings, new cases arising from ongoing police investigations, new opportunities for the legal system to demonstrate its capacity for fairness and wisdom in addressing the complex human situations that crime created. But tonight, the building rested in the quiet dignity that characterized all important institutions during their hours of contemplation. The courthouse stood ready to resume its vital work when morning came, prepared to transform the careful investigations of police officers into the deliberate processes of justice that made civilized community life possible. Maple Street stretched in a gentle curve through the Riverside district, lined with modest houses that had been built in the 1960s when the neighborhood was first developed. Detective Jennifer Walsh walked slowly along the sidewalk in the early evening light, observing the quiet domestic scenes that played out behind lighted windows and in carefully tended front yards. This was her patrol route during community policing shifts, but tonight she walked simply to remember, to reconnect with the human stories that gave meaning to the cases documented in distant archives. The house at 1247 Oak Street, where Harold and Mary Fitzgerald had experienced their burglary 15 years earlier, now belonged to their daughter Susan and her young family. The Fitzgeralds had moved to a retirement community after Harold's mild stroke, but they had chosen to keep the house in the family rather than sell it to strangers. Detective Walsh could see Susan through the kitchen window, helping her 8-year-old son with homework, at the same table where her parents had once planned their daily routines, break-in that had once shattered the Fitzgeralds' sense of security had become family history, a story that Susan told her children not to frighten them, but to help them understand the importance of neighbors looking out for each other. The silver spoons that had been stolen and recovered were now displayed in Susan's dining room cabinet, their history of theft and return having added to rather than diminished their sentimental value. Detective Walsh remembered visiting the house during the follow-up investigation, when Detective Park had been working to connect the Fitzgerald burglary to the larger pattern of crimes in the neighborhood. The elderly couple had been gracious and patient, understanding that their cooperation was essential, not just for their own case, but for protecting other potential victims. The resolution of their case had brought more than just the return of stolen property. The investigation had revealed vulnerabilities in neighborhood security and communication that residents had worked together to address. The block now had an informal watch system, with neighbors sharing information about unusual activities and maintaining regular contact with elderly residents who might be particularly vulnerable to crime. Mrs. Chun, who still lived across the street from the Fitzgerald house, had become an unofficial coordinator for neighborhood safety efforts. Now in her 80s, she maintained a daily routine of walking through the area, not as formal surveillance, but as the natural movement of someone who cared about her community and wanted to stay connected with her neighbors' lives. Detective Walsh stopped to speak with Mrs. Chun, who was watering flowers in her front garden. The conversation, conducted in the easy rhythm of people who had known each other for years, touched on the small details of neighborhood life that revealed how communities actually function beneath the surface of official institutions. Mrs. Chen mentioned that the new family who had moved into the Rodriguez house seemed to be settling in well, with children who played quietly in the backyard and parents who had introduced themselves to surrounding neighbors. She noted that the teenage daughter from the Morrison house had gotten her driver's license and was being very careful about parking in ways that didn't block other residents' driveways. These observations, shared in the casual tone of friendly conversation, represented the kind of informal intelligence gathering that made neighborhoods safe and cohesive. Mrs. Chun's daily walks and regular conversations with neighbors created a network of awareness that could identify problems before they escalated, and that provided support for families facing various challenges. Detective Walsh continued her walk toward Elm Street, where the Morrison family had once struggled with domestic violence issues that had required multiple police interventions. The house looked peaceful in the evening light, with children's bicycles visible in the driveway, and flower boxes that suggested careful attention to creating a welcoming home environment. David and Jennifer Morrison still lived there, their marriage having survived the crisis that had once brought them to police attention. The intervention that Officer Park had facilitated had been followed by years of counseling and gradual rebuilding of trust and communication. David's participation in alcohol treatment had been successful, and he had found stable employment that reduced the financial stress that had contributed to the family's problems. Jennifer Morrison had become involved in support groups for families affected by domestic violence, using her experience to help other women understand their options and resources. Her work with these organizations had been quiet and behind the scenes, but it had contributed to a broader community understanding of how to recognize and address domestic violence before it escalated to dangerous levels. The Morrison children, now teenagers, had grown up with an understanding of how families could overcome serious problems through honest communication and professional support. Their experience had made them particularly sensitive to classmates who might be dealing with similar issues at home, and they had been trained to recognize warning signs and to know how to connect troubled friends with appropriate resources. Detective Walsh could see Jennifer Morrison through the living room window, reading with her daughter on the sofa where arguments had once escalated to the point where neighbors felt compelled to call police. The transformation represented not just individual healing but community resilience, the way that neighborhoods could support families through crises and help them emerge stronger. She walked past the elementary school where Maria Santos, the young woman who had been involved in the vandalism case, now worked as an art teacher. Santos had used her community service experience as the foundation for a career in education, discovering that her artistic talents and her understanding of teenage frustration made her effective at connecting with students who felt disconnected from traditional academic programs. The art program that Santos had helped establish had become a model for other schools, demonstrating how creative activities could provide positive outlets for young people's energy while also building skills and confidence that carried over into other areas of their lives. The program included after-school workshops and summer camps that served students from throughout the district, many of whom came from families facing various economic and social challenges. Detective Walsh had visited the school several times for educational programs about law enforcement and community safety. Santos had always been welcoming and had spoken openly with students about her own experience with the criminal justice system, helping them understand that making mistakes as teenagers did not have to determine the course of their entire lives. The school's main hallway contained a large mural that Santos and her students had created together, depicting the neighborhood's history and the diverse families that made up the school community. The mural included subtle references to challenges that the area had faced, including crime and economic difficulties, but it emphasized themes of resilience, cooperation, and hope for the future. Detective Walsh continued toward the downtown area, where many of the businesses affected by various crimes had adapted and evolved over the years. The Morrison Art Supplies store, where Detective Thompson had developed the lead that solved the graffiti case, had expanded to include framing services and art classes for adults and children. Samuel Morrison, the store owner, had become an advocate for supporting young artists through legitimate channels rather than simply punishing them when their creativity found illegal expression. His store now hosted monthly exhibitions of work by local high school students, providing recognition and encouragement for young people who were developing their artistic skills. The community center where Maria Santos had created her first legal mural had become a hub for various programs that addressed the underlying causes of youth crime. The center offered tutoring, job training, recreation programs, and counseling, services that helped young people develop positive relationships with adults and peers, while building skills that would serve them throughout their lives. Detective Walsh stopped at Riverside Park, where Timothy Walsh, the 14-year-old boy who had been abducted years earlier, now brought his own children to play on the same playground equipment where he had once played as a child. Timothy had grown up to become a social worker, specializing in trauma counseling. His experience as a crime victim having motivated him to help other people recover from difficult experiences. His work included consulting with law enforcement agencies about how to interview child victims and witnesses in ways that minimized additional trauma while still gathering the information necessary for successful prosecutions. Timothy's insights had contributed to improved training for police officers and had helped develop protocols that better protected vulnerable witnesses during legal proceedings. The park itself had been improved over the years with better lighting, enhanced security features, and programming that encouraged families to use the space during evening hours when it had once been relatively deserted. The changes reflected community learning from the abduction incident, with residents working together to create environments that were both welcoming and safe. Detective Walsh sat on a bench near the playground, watching families enjoy the evening air, while children played with the carefree energy that suggested they felt secure in their environment. The scene represented one of the most important outcomes of effective law enforcement: communities where people could live without constant fear, where children could develop normally, where families could focus on building positive relationships rather than simply protecting themselves from danger. The bench where she sat had been donated by the Hoffman family, in memory of Eleanor Hoffman, the elderly woman whose temporary disappearance had led to such an intensive search effort. Mrs. Hoffman had eventually died peacefully in her sleep, several years after her successful reunion with her brother in Portland. But her family had wanted to create a memorial that celebrated her love of community and her appreciation for the kindness that strangers had shown during her time of confusion. The memorial bench included a small plaque that quoted Mrs. Hoffman's favorite saying, "Communities are built one conversation at a time." The sentiment reflected her belief that neighborhoods became strong through the accumulated small interactions that created bonds of mutual care and responsibility. Detective Walsh could see the bench being used throughout the day by parents watching their children play, elderly residents taking breaks during their daily walks, and teenagers who sometimes gathered there after school to talk about their plans and concerns. The bench had become exactly what Mrs. Hoffman's family had hoped, a place where conversations happened naturally and where people felt connected to their community. She left the park and walked toward the Westfield Mall, where Detective Martinez had once solved a series of car break-ins through patient observation and community education. The mall had evolved significantly over the years, with improved lighting, enhanced security patrols, and better communication systems that allowed shoppers to report suspicious activities quickly and discreetly. The teenagers who had been responsible for the original break-ins had eventually become productive members of the community, their brush with the criminal justice system having served as a wake-up call that motivated them to make better choices. One of them now worked in mall security, using his understanding of how parking lot crimes were committed to help develop more effective prevention strategies. Detective Walsh walked through the downtown business district, where many of the establishments had been affected by various crimes over the years, but had persevered and adapted. The pawn shop where Detective Park had discovered the stolen silver spoons had implemented enhanced record-keeping procedures and had become a model for how such businesses could assist law enforcement while still serving their legitimate customers. The owner, who had initially been reluctant to cooperate with police investigations, had eventually become an advocate for industry standards that helped prevent the sale of stolen merchandise while protecting honest dealers from unfair suspicion. His shop now provided training for other pawn shop operators about how to recognize potentially stolen items and how to work effectively with law enforcement agencies. The banks where the check fraud scheme had been carried out had improved their training programs for tellers and had implemented new technologies that made it more difficult to alter checks without detection. The improvements had been developed in consultation with Detective Kim and other investigators who understood the specific techniques that financial criminals used to exploit weaknesses in the banking system. Thomas Rodriguez, the former bank employee who had been responsible for the check fraud, had served his sentence and had found employment in a field that allowed him to use his financial skills in legitimate ways. His case had become part of training programs for bank employees, helping them understand how insider knowledge could be misused and what warning signs might indicate that a colleague was engaging in criminal activity. Walsh stopped at the public library, where the rare book collection had been rebuilt and enhanced following the theft that Professor Whitfield had committed years earlier. The collection was now housed in a more secure facility with improved access controls and monitoring systems, but it remained available to legitimate researchers and scholars who needed access to historical materials. Professor Whitfield himself had become involved in the library's security planning, his experience as both a scholar and a criminal having provided unique insights into how valuable collections could be protected without becoming inaccessible to the researchers who needed them. His community service had evolved into ongoing volunteer work that helped the library balance security concerns. With its educational mission, the library had also developed programs that brought historical materials to community groups and schools, reducing the need for valuable items to be handled by casual visitors while still making their contents available to people who could benefit from learning about local history. The programs had been particularly popular with elderly residents who enjoyed sharing their memories of the events and people described in historical documents. Detective Walsh continued her walk through the neighborhood where Maria Santos, the nurse who had experienced a dissociative episode, had rebuilt her life and career. Santos had returned to her work at the hospital and had become an advocate for improved understanding of trauma-related psychological conditions among healthcare workers and law enforcement personnel. Her experience had contributed to training programs that helped police officers recognize when missing persons might be suffering from medical conditions rather than simply choosing to disappear. The training had been particularly valuable for cases involving elderly people who might be more vulnerable to conditions that could affect memory and judgment. Santos had also worked with hospital staff to develop protocols for treating patients who were found after being reported missing, ensuring that they received appropriate medical evaluation and psychological support during what could be a confusing and frightening experience. Her insights had helped create more compassionate and effective responses to situations that were often misunderstood by both medical professionals and family members. The neighborhood where Santos lived had rallied around her during her recovery, with neighbors and colleagues providing practical support and emotional encouragement as she worked to rebuild her confidence and resume her normal routines. The experience had strengthened community bonds and had created networks of mutual support that continued to benefit residents facing various challenges. Detective Walsh walked past the house where Mrs. Wong, the elderly woman who had been caught shoplifting food, had lived during her time of financial crisis. The house now belonged to her daughter, who had moved back to town to provide support during her mother's final years. Mrs. Wong had died peacefully at home, surrounded by family and friends who had helped her maintain her dignity and independence, despite the economic difficulties that had once led her to desperate measures. The case had led to improved outreach programs for elderly residents who might be struggling with financial difficulties but who were too proud or embarrassed to seek help through official channels. The programs emphasized dignity and respect, offering assistance in ways that felt like community support rather than charity. The grocery store where Mrs. Wong had been caught shoplifting, had become a partner in these outreach efforts, with employees trained to recognize customers who might be experiencing food insecurity and to connect them with appropriate resources. The store's approach had become a model for other businesses that wanted to support their communities while also protecting themselves from theft. Detective Walsh ended her walk at the senior center where Mrs. Wong had volunteered during her final years, helping other elderly people navigate the complex systems of social support that could provide assistance during times of need. The center had expanded its programs to include services that addressed not just immediate needs, but the social isolation that often contributed to elderly people's vulnerability. The volunteer program that Mrs. Wong had joined had grown to include dozens of older adults who used their life experience to help their peers cope with various challenges. The program had been particularly successful because it recognized that elderly people often preferred to receive help from others who understood their experiences and who treated them as capable adults rather than helpless victims. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, Detective Walsh could see the warm lights in windows that suggested families gathering for evening meals, children completing homework, adults discussing the events of their days. The scenes represented the ultimate goal of all police work: communities where people could live normal lives without constant fear, where families could focus on growth and connection rather than simply protection and survival. The streets were quiet but not empty, with evening joggers, dog walkers, and neighbors engaged in the casual conversations that created the social fabric of healthy communities. The presence of people engaging in normal activities suggested that residents felt safe in their environment and confident that problems would be addressed through appropriate channels. Detective Walsh reflected on how the cases she had studied in the archives had ultimately been resolved, not just through arrests and prosecutions, but through the patient work of rebuilding trust and addressing underlying problems. The most successful outcomes had involved entire communities working together to support victims, hold offenders accountable, and create conditions that made future crimes less likely. The neighborhood she walked through represented the accumulated impact of countless individual cases, each one contributing to a gradual strengthening of social bonds and community resilience. The work of police officers, prosecutors, judges, social workers, and ordinary citizens had combined to create an environment where crime was neither ignored nor allowed to dominate community life. As she made her way back to her car, Detective Walsh felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that her work was part of this larger process of community building and maintenance. The cases documented in the archives were not just historical curiosities but ongoing contributions to the safety and well-being of neighborhoods where real families lived their daily lives. The city around her continued its evening rhythms, with people heading home from work, families gathering for dinner, children playing in yards that felt secure and welcoming. These ordinary scenes represented the true measure of successful law enforcement, not the drama of arrests and trials, but the quiet confidence that came from living in communities where justice was both available and fair, where problems were addressed thoughtfully, and where everyone had the opportunity to contribute to the common good. Detective Walsh drove home through streets that were busy but not chaotic, populated but not crowded, active but not frantic. The city had found its rhythm, a balance between individual freedom and community responsibility that made civilized life possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new crimes to investigate, new opportunities to serve and protect. But tonight, the neighborhood rested in the quiet satisfaction of problems solved and communities strengthened through the patient application of justice and compassion. The central police station at 3 in the morning possessed a quality of stillness that transformed the familiar spaces of daytime. activity into something almost sacred. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had grown to love these quiet hours during her 15 years of night shift work. When the building settled into its deepest rhythms and the work of law enforcement revealed its most contemplative character, the main desk area, usually bustling with the controlled chaos of shift changes and public inquiries, now held only the essential personnel who maintained the city's safety during the hours when most citizens slept peacefully in their homes. The duty officer's station glowed with the soft light of computer monitors displaying maps, incident reports, and communication channels that connected the station to patrol units. Moving quietly through the darkened streets, Sergeant Rodriguez walked slowly through the corridors, checking on the various departments that continued their work throughout the night. Her rounds were part security procedure and part personal ritual, a way of staying connected to the building and the people who kept it, functioning during the hours when the outside world seemed to pause in its relentless activity. Records Division maintained a skeleton crew during night hours, with one clerk on duty to handle any urgent requests for case files or background information that patrol officers might need for ongoing investigations. Tonight, Detective Foster was working alone in the archives, pursuing some research project that had captured her attention during her off-duty hours. Rodriguez paused at the entrance to the archives, observing Detective Foster's patient work among the filing cabinets that held decades of the department's institutional memory. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing how individual officers chose to spend their discretionary time, the way that dedication to police work extended beyond official duties to include personal exploration of the professions, history, and accumulated wisdom. That the archive area during night shift possessed an almost library-like atmosphere, with soft lighting that created pools of illumination around reading areas while leaving the vast expanses of filing cabinets in respectful shadow. The silence was profound, but not empty, filled with the weight of thousands of cases that had been resolved through patient investigation and careful documentation. Rodriguez continued her rounds to the communications center, where dispatcher Patricia Chun managed the flow of emergency calls and radio traffic that connected the station to patrol units throughout the city. The communications center operated as the nervous system of police operations, processing information and coordinating responses with the calm efficiency that public safety required. Chun had been working night shift dispatch for more than 20 years, developing an intuitive understanding of the city's rhythms and the patterns of activity that characterize different hours and seasons. She could predict with remarkable accuracy when and where certain types of calls were likely to occur, knowledge that helped her prepare officers for situations they might encounter during their patrols. The communications center contained multiple radio channels, computer terminals displaying real-time incident data, and direct phone lines to other emergency services. During busy periods, the center buzzed with coordinated activity, but during quiet night hours, it maintained a steady background hum of routine check-ins and periodic status reports that confirmed the system's continuous operation. Rodriguez listened to Chun's calm voice as she conducted routine radio checks with patrol units, confirming their locations and status with the professional efficiency that characterized all aspects of her work. The conversations were brief and functional, but they created an invisible network of connection that ensured no officer worked in isolation and that help was always available when situations required additional resources. She moved on to the detective division, where several investigators were working on cases that required night shift attention. Detective Park was reviewing surveillance footage from a recent burglary, using the quiet hours to analyze video recordings that required careful attention to detail. The footage played on a large monitor, showing the slow movements of figures, captured in grainy black and white images that had to be studied frame by framed to yield useful information. Detective work area during night shift had a scholarly atmosphere, with investigators able to concentrate on analytical tasks without the interruptions that characterized daytime operations. Reports were written with careful attention to detail. Evidence was processed with methodical thoroughness, and case files were reviewed with the kind of comprehensive attention that complex investigations required. Detective Kim was working on financial records related to an embezzlement case. Spreadsheets and bank statements arranged across his desk in patterns that revealed the flow of money through various accounts. The investigation required the kind of detailed analysis that was best conducted during quiet hours when concentration could be maintained without interruption. Rodriguez observed how night shift detectives approached their work with a different energy than their day shift colleagues. Less hurried, but no less focused, taking advantage of the peaceful environment to pursue investigations that required sustained intellectual effort. The work represented police investigation at its most thoughtful and systematic, far removed from the dramatic portrayals of law enforcement that dominated popular culture. She continued to the evidence room, where Officer Williams was processing items that had been collected during the day shift. The evidence room operated according to strict protocols that ensured the integrity of materials that might eventually be presented in court, with every item carefully cataloged, sealed, and stored according to procedures that had been refined over decades of legal experience. The evidence room, during night shift, revealed its role as a repository of truth, a place where physical objects were preserved in conditions that would allow them to tell their stories months or years later when legal proceedings required their testimony. The work was methodical and precise, involving attention to detail that reflected the serious responsibility of maintaining evidence that could determine the outcomes of criminal cases. Officer Williams moved to the evidence room with practiced efficiency, checking storage conditions, updating computerized records, and ensuring that everything was properly organized for easy retrieval when investigators or attorneys needed access to specific items. The work required both technical knowledge and careful attention to the legal requirements that governed evidence handling. Rodriguez walked past the holding cells, currently empty but cleaned and prepared for any arrests that night shift officers might make during their patrols. The cells were Spartan but clean, designed to provide secure temporary housing for people who had been arrested, while ensuring their safety and basic dignity during the booking process. The holding area included a booking station where arrestees were processed, photographed, and fingerprinted according to procedures that balanced efficiency with respect for individual rights. Even during quiet periods, the area was maintained in constant readiness, reflecting the unpredictable nature of police work and the need to be prepared for situations that might arise without warning. She continued to the roll call room, where the night shift briefing had taken place several hours earlier. The room retained the lingering energy of that gathering, when officers had received information about ongoing investigations, crime patterns, and special situations that might require attention during their patrols. The briefing board still displayed maps and photographs related to current cases, creating a visual summary of the department's active investigations and community concerns. The information was updated regularly to ensure that all officers remained informed about developments that might affect their work or the safety of the communities they served. Rodriguez remembered the earlier briefing, when Sergeant Thompson had discussed the follow-up investigation of a domestic violence case that had been resolved several months earlier. The family was doing well, with the husband successfully completing his treatment program, and the wife reporting that she felt safe and supported in her home environment. The briefing had also included updates on several burglary investigations, with detectives sharing information about patterns they had identified and requesting that patrol officers pay particular attention to certain neighborhoods during their regular rounds. The collaborative approach reflected the integrated nature of police work, where patrol officers and detectives worked together to address both immediate incidents and longer-term crime patterns. Rodriguez made her way to the Community Relations Office, where materials were stored for educational programs and community engagement activities that took place during regular business hours. The office contained displays about crime prevention, drug awareness, and safety programs that officers presented at schools, community centers, and neighborhood meetings. The community relations materials reflected the department's commitment to proactive engagement with citizens, recognizing that effective law enforcement required ongoing communication and cooperation between police officers and the communities they served. The programs addressed everything from child safety to elderly fraud prevention, providing practical information that helped residents protect themselves and their families. The office also contained thank you letters and photographs from community events, creating a visual record of the positive relationships that police officers had built with citizens throughout the city. The materials demonstrated that law enforcement involved much more than responding to crimes, encompassing education, prevention, and community-building activities that strengthened social bonds. She continued to the training room, where new officers learned the skills and procedures that would guide their careers in law enforcement. The room contained equipment for firearms training, legal education materials, and simulation exercises that helped officers prepare for the complex situations they would encounter during their service. The training room represented the department's commitment to continuous learning and professional development, recognizing that effective police work required both technical skills and deep understanding of human behavior and community dynamics. The training programs address not just law enforcement techniques, but also communication skills, conflict resolution, and cultural sensitivity. Rodriguez thought about her own training experience many years earlier, when veteran officers had shared their knowledge and wisdom with recruits who were eager to begin their careers in public service. The mentoring relationships that developed during training often continued throughout officers' careers, creating networks of mutual support and shared commitment to professional excellence. The Patrol Division office contained assignment sheets and equipment that officers used during their shifts, from radio equipment to report forms to the various tools that patrol work required. The office was organized with military-like precision, reflecting the need for efficiency and reliability in situations where officers' lives might depend on having access to the right equipment at the right time. The Patrol Assignment Board showed the current deployment of officers throughout the city, with each unit's location and status updated regularly to maintain awareness of resource allocation and response capabilities. The system ensured that all areas of the city received appropriate coverage, while maintaining flexibility to respond to unusual situations or emergency calls. Rodriguez checked the patrol log, noting the routine activities that officers had reported during the first half of their shift: traffic stops, welfare checks, routine patrols of commercial areas, and follow-up visits to locations where recent incidents had occurred. The log reflected the steady, methodical nature of patrol work that formed the foundation of community safety. She walked to the watch commander's office, where Lieutenant Foster maintained oversight of night shift operations and served as the senior decision-maker for situations that required immediate attention. The office contained radio equipment, computer terminals, and direct phone lines to other emergency services, creating a command center that could coordinate complex responses when situations required multiple resources. Lieutenant Foster was reviewing reports from the evening shift, analyzing incident patterns and resource utilization to identify trends that might require operational adjustments. The analysis represented the kind of strategic thinking that characterized effective police management, using data and experience to improve service delivery and officer safety. The watch commander's role included responsibility for officer welfare, ensuring that personnel had the support and resources they needed to perform their duties safely and effectively. Lieutenant Foster maintained regular communication with patrol units, not just for operational coordination, but to monitor officer status and provide assistance when situations became challenging or dangerous. Rodriguez continued to the property room, where items recovered during investigations were stored until they could be returned to their owners or disposed of according to legal requirements. The property room contained everything from bicycles and electronics to personal items that had been stolen and subsequently recovered through police investigations. The property room operations reflected one of the most satisfying aspects of police work: the opportunity to restore stolen property to its rightful owners and to help victims recover from the violations they had experienced. The careful inventory and storage procedures ensured that recovered items could be returned in good condition, often bringing closure to cases that had begun with someone's sense of loss and violation. Officer Martinez was working in the property room during night shift, updating computerized records and preparing items for return to owners whose cases had been resolved. The work required attention to detail and careful coordination with detectives and victims to arrange for property return at times that were convenient for all parties involved. Rodriguez observed how Officer Martinez approached his work with genuine care for the people whose possessions he was handling, understanding that each item represented something important to its owner, regardless of its monetary value. The attitude reflected the human dimension of police work that extended beyond technical procedures to encompass genuine concern for community members' well-being. The building's basement areas contained mechanical systems and storage, facilities that kept the station functioning 24 hours a day. The heating and cooling systems, emergency generators, and communication equipment required regular maintenance and monitoring to ensure reliable operation during all conditions. The basement also housed the department's computer servers and data storage systems, creating a technological foundation that supported everything from records management to communications to evidence processing. The systems required constant attention from technical specialists who ensured that critical information remained accessible and secure. Rodriguez made her way back to the main level, completing her rounds with a stop at the front desk where Officer Chun managed public contact during night hours. The front desk area was designed to be welcoming but secure, providing a place where citizens could report crimes, seek assistance, or obtain information about police services. Officer Chun's work during night shift often involved providing assistance to people who were experiencing crises or who needed help navigating complex situations. The role required both law enforcement knowledge and social service skills, as many people who came to the police station during night hours were dealing with problems that extended beyond simple law enforcement issues. The front desk area contained brochures and informational materials about various community services, from domestic violence resources to mental health programs to financial assistance for crime victims. The materials reflected the department's understanding that effective law enforcement often involved connecting people with appropriate resources rather than simply processing criminal cases. Rodriguez returned to her office, where she maintained oversight of night shift patrol operations and served as a resource for officers who needed assistance or guidance during their shifts. Her office contained multiple communication systems that kept her connected to patrol units, other police departments, and emergency services throughout the region. The night shift supervisor's role included responsibility for making tactical decisions about resource deployment, authorizing overtime when situations required additional personnel, and coordinating with other agencies when incidents crossed jurisdictional boundaries or required specialized expertise. Rodriguez reviewed the incident log for the shift, noting that activity had been relatively quiet, with mostly routine calls that had been handled efficiently by patrol officers. The quiet periods allowed officers to conduct proactive patrols, follow up on previous cases, and engage in community policing activities that strengthened relationships with citizens. She checked in with the communications center, confirming that all patrol units were accounted for and that radio communications were functioning properly. The routine check-ins created a rhythm of connection and accountability that ensured officer safety while maintaining operational efficiency. The station clock showed that the shift was approaching its midpoint, with several hours remaining before the transition to day shift operations. The night shift work would continue its steady pace, maintaining the continuity of service that ensured public safety around the clock. Rodriguez thought about the officers working throughout the city, conducting patrols in neighborhoods where families slept peacefully because they trusted that help was available if needed. The quiet nature of night shift work often made it seem less dramatic than day shift operations, but it represented the foundation of community safety and the commitment to continuous service that characterized professional law enforcement. The police radio provided a steady background of routine communications, check-ins, and status reports that confirmed the ongoing operation of the system that protected the city during its most vulnerable hours. The communications created an invisible network of connection and mutual support that ensured no officer worked in isolation. As the night continued, Rodriguez maintained her oversight responsibilities while reflecting on the broader meaning of the work that took place in this building during all hours of the day and night. The station represented more than just a workplace. It was a symbol of society's commitment to order, justice, and the protection of individual rights and community safety. The building itself seemed to embody the patient, methodical nature of police work at its best, providing a stable foundation for the complex activities that transformed reported crimes into resolved cases, chaos into order, fear into security. The work continued regardless of the hour, maintaining the social contract that allowed citizens to live their lives with confidence that help was available when needed. Rodriguez completed her paperwork and prepared for the remaining hours of her shift, knowing that the quiet efficiency of night operations would continue until the morning transition brought new personnel and new challenges. The station would maintain its vital functions, ensuring that the community remained safe and that justice remained available to all who needed it. The city outside continued its restful breathing, with most residents unaware of the dedicated professionals who worked throughout the night to maintain the safety and order that made civilized life possible. The night shift represented law enforcement at its most essential, providing the continuous service that demonstrated society's commitment to protecting its most vulnerable members during their most vulnerable hours. Asterisk. The photography division occupied a climate-controlled wing of the basement archives, where thousands of photographs rested in acid-free storage boxes that protected them from the slow deterioration that could erase visual evidence of crimes that had shaped the community's history. Detective Thomas Kim found these archives particularly compelling during his off-duty hours, when the building's quietude allowed for contemplation of how images preserve truth in ways that written reports, however detailed, could never fully capture. The storage area stretched and organized, rose beneath soft fluorescent lighting that had been specially chosen to minimize damage to photographic materials while providing adequate illumination for researchers who needed to examine specific images. Each box was labeled with case numbers, dates, and brief descriptions that created a comprehensive index of visual documentation spanning more than 4 decades of police work. Detective Kim pulled storage box 1987A, which contained photographs from cases investigated during that pivotal year when the department had begun transitioning from film photography to early digital imaging systems. The box felt substantial in his hands, weighted with the accumulated visual evidence of crimes that had once commanded headlines, but had now settled into the peaceful resolution that time brought to all human conflicts. The first photograph he examined was a crime scene image from the Fitzgerald burglary, showing the elderly couple's living room as Officer Winters had found it that February morning. The photograph captured details that even the most careful written description could not convey. The particular way sunlight fell through the front window onto furniture that had been displaced but not destroyed. The careful arrangement of items that suggested the burglar had worked with unusual consideration for the residents. Property. The image revealed the Fitzgeralds' home as a place where two people had built a life together over many decades, filled with furniture chosen for comfort rather than style. Photographs of children and grandchildren arranged on surfaces that spoke of daily attention and care. The burglary had disrupted this careful domestic order, but the photograph showed that the disruption had been relatively gentle. More invasion than destruction. Detective Kim could see in the photograph details that supplemented Officer Winter's written report, the book that lay open on the coffee table, suggesting that Mrs. Fitzgerald had been reading when they left for their grocery shopping trip. The sweater draped over the back of a chair in the casual way that spoke of a home where people felt comfortable and secure. The burglary had violated this security, but the photograph suggested that the essential character of the home had survived the intrusion. The next photograph showed the recovered silver spoons arranged on a table in the police station's evidence room, each piece carefully positioned to show its condition and identifying characteristics. The image captured the delicate engravings and family monograms that made these items irreplaceable to their owners, while also documenting the careful attention that investigators had paid to preserving evidence that might be needed for prosecution. The photograph of the recovered spoons had been taken not just for evidentiary purposes but as documentation that could be provided to the insurance company and to Mrs. Fitzgerald herself, proof that her grandmother's silver had been recovered intact and would be returned to its proper place in her dining room cabinet. The image served multiple purposes: legal evidence, insurance documentation, and reassurance to victims that their property would be treated with respect. Detective Kim found photographs from the Morrison embezzlement case, images that documented the complex paper trail Patricia Morrison had created to conceal her theft of company funds. The photograph showed financial records arranged on tables in patterns that revealed the flow of money through various accounts, creating visual representations of fraudulent transactions that would have been difficult to understand through written descriptions alone. One photograph showed Morrison's desk as investigators had found it, with personal items arranged alongside the business documents she had used to facilitate her crimes. The image captured the strange juxtaposition of family photographs and fraudulent bank records, suggesting the complex personal circumstances that had motivated an otherwise honest employee to begin stealing from her employer. The photographs from the Morrison case included images of the computer equipment that had been used to create false vendor accounts and generate fictitious invoices. The technology appeared primitive by current standards, but the images documented how relatively simple tools could be used to commit sophisticated financial crimes when operated by someone with insider knowledge of business accounting systems. Detective Kim examined photographs from the art theft investigation, images that documented both the sophistication of the stolen artwork and the careful techniques that had been used to remove pieces from their owners' homes. The photographs showed security systems that had been defeated, walls where paintings had been removed with surgical precision, and storage areas where stolen artwork had been hidden before being transported to auction houses in other cities. One particularly striking photograph showed the recovery of stolen paintings from Robert Chun's warehouse, with dozens of valuable pieces arranged in a space that looked more like a legitimate gallery than a criminal storage facility. The image suggested that Chun had genuinely appreciated the aesthetic value of the artwork he was stealing, treating the pieces with care even as he violated their owner's rights and disrupted the legitimate art market. The photograph of Chun's arrest showed him standing beside a van filled with stolen artwork, his expression suggesting more surprise than defiance, as if he had never fully considered that his sophisticated operation would eventually be discovered by equally sophisticated police investigation. The image captured a moment of reckoning when someone's careful criminal planning collided with the patient. Methodical work of law enforcement. Detective Kim found a series of photographs from the missing person investigation of Eleanor Hoffman. Images that documented both the search efforts and the eventual resolution of the case. The photographs showed search teams combing through wooded areas and abandoned buildings, volunteers distributing flyers with Mrs. Hoffman's photograph, and eventually the reunion between the elderly woman and Detective Reynolds. In the Denver hospital where she had been receiving medical care. The photograph of Mrs. Hoffman's reunion with Detective Reynolds captured a moment of profound relief and gratitude, showing an elderly woman whose confusion had cleared enough for her to understand how many people had worked to find her and bring her safely home. The image demonstrated one of the most rewarding aspects of police work, the opportunity to restore people to their families and communities when they had been lost or displaced. The series also included photographs of Mrs. Hoffman's apartment as Detective Reynolds had found it during his investigation, showing the careful domestic order that had characterized her daily life and the subtle disruptions that had suggested she was preparing for an unplanned journey. The images served as visual evidence of the detective's patient analytical approach, documenting observations that had eventually led to understanding Mrs. Hoffman's state of mind and likely destination. Detective Kim pulled another storage box, this one containing photographs from cases investigated during 1979, when the department had still relied exclusively on film photography and manual darkroom processing. The images had a different quality than later photographs, with the particular grain and contrast that characterized film photography. At its most skillful, the photographs from Professor Whitfield's rare book theft showed the library's climate-controlled vault where the stolen materials had been housed, with empty spaces on shelves that documented exactly which items had been taken and how the thief had rearranged remaining books to disguise the extent of his theft. The images captured the scholarly atmosphere of the rare book collection while also documenting the violation of trust that had occurred when someone with legitimate access had used that privilege for criminal purposes. One photograph showed Professor Whitfield's office as investigators had found it, filled with the academic materials and personal items that revealed his genuine scholarly interests alongside evidence of his financial desperation. The image suggested the complex motivations that had led a respected intellectual to commit crimes that contradicted his professional values and community standing. The photographs from the historic district burglary case showed architectural details that had been stolen from 19th century buildings, with close-up images that documented the craftsmanship and historical significance of items that had been removed for sale to collectors. The photographs served both as evidence of theft and as documentation of the community's architectural heritage that had been threatened by the crimes. Detective Kim found particularly moving a photograph that showed the return of stolen architectural elements to their original buildings, with community volunteers and preservation specialists working together to restore historical integrity that had been compromised by criminal activity. The image captured the collaborative effort required to heal the damage that crime had inflicted on the community's cultural heritage. The photographs from Maria Santos's missing person case documented both the search efforts and the medical treatment she had received after being found in the Denver shelter. The images showed Santos during her recovery, as her memory gradually returned and she was able to reconnect with the life she had temporarily lost during her dissociative episode. One photograph showed Santos back at work at the hospital, surrounded by colleagues who had supported her during her absence and recovery. The image captured the relief and joy of a workplace community that had been reunited with a valued member, demonstrating how missing person cases affected not just families, but entire networks of friends and colleagues who cared about the absent person. Detective Kim examined photographs from the domestic violence intervention at the Morrison household, images that documented both the physical evidence of altercations and the gradual improvement in family relationships as counseling and treatment programs helped address underlying problems. The photograph showed the same living space at different times, revealing how domestic environments could be transformed through patient intervention and support. The early photographs from the Morrison case showed furniture displacement, damaged items, and other physical evidence of domestic conflict that had escalated beyond normal family disagreements. Later photographs showed the same rooms restored to order, with evidence of the family activities and positive interactions that had replaced the destructive patterns that had once characterized the household. The series included a photograph of David Morrison participating in a community service project, using his construction skills to help repair damage at a local community center. The image captured the transformation that could occur when someone's destructive impulses were redirected toward constructive activities that benefited both the individual and the broader community. Detective Kim found photographs from the check fraud investigation, images that documented the sophisticated techniques Thomas Rodriguez had used to alter stolen checks and the equipment that investigators had discovered in his apartment. The photographs showed both the technical skill required for document alteration and the elaborate record keeping that Rodriguez had maintained to track his criminal activities. One photograph showed Rodriguez's apartment as investigators had found it, with document alteration equipment arranged alongside family photographs and personal items that suggested someone living a double life, maintaining normal domestic routines while engaging in systematic criminal activity. The image captured the strange compartmentalization that characterized many white-collar crimes. Photographs from Rodriguez's arrest showed him cooperating with investigators as they documented his check alteration techniques, apparently relieved to end the stress of maintaining his criminal activities while living in constant fear of discovery. The images suggested that criminal behavior often created as much anxiety for perpetrators as it did harm for victims. Detective Kim pulled a storage box containing photographs from more recent cases, images captured with digital cameras that provided greater detail and color accuracy than earlier film photography. The technological advancement had improved the quality of visual evidence, while also allowing for easier reproduction and distribution of images that needed to be shared among investigators or presented in court. The digital photographs from Timothy Walsh's abduction case showed both the search efforts and the location where he had been held by his captor. The images documented the makeshift living space that Marcus Williams had created in the abandoned warehouse, revealing the delusional fantasy that had motivated the kidnapping while also showing the physical conditions that Timothy had endured during his captivity. One photograph showed Timothy's reunion with his parents, capturing a moment of overwhelming relief and joy that demonstrated the successful resolution of every parent's worst nightmare. The image served as visual testimony to the value of the intensive search effort that had involved dozens of officers and volunteers working around the clock to locate the missing boy. The series also included photographs of Marcus Williams receiving mental health treatment, documenting the compassionate approach that had been taken to address the psychological problems that had motivated his criminal behavior. The images suggested that effective criminal justice involved not just punishment, but genuine efforts to address underlying causes of criminal activity. Detective Kim examined photographs from the car break-in investigation at Westfield Mall. Images that documented both the criminal techniques used by the teenage perpetrators and the community education efforts that had been implemented to prevent similar crimes. The photograph showed Detective Martinez conducting information sessions with shoppers, demonstrating how police work extended beyond investigation and arrest to include education and crime prevention. The photographs from the MALL case included images of recovered stolen property arranged for return to victims, showing personal items and electronic devices that represented both monetary loss and violation of privacy that car break-ins inflicted on their victims. The careful arrangement of recovered property demonstrated the respect that investigators showed for victims' possessions and their commitment to restoring order after criminal disruption. One photograph showed the teenage perpetrators performing community service at the mall, working with maintenance staff to repair damage and improve security in the parking areas where they had committed their crimes. The image captured the restorative approach that had been taken to their cases, requiring them to contribute positively to the community they had harmed. Detective Kim found photographs from the shoplifting case involving elderly Mrs. Wong, images that documented both the initial incident and the comprehensive social service intervention that had addressed the underlying problems that had motivated her desperate actions. The photographs showed Mrs. Wong receiving assistance at the food bank and participating in senior center activities that had restored her dignity and provided ongoing support. The series included a photograph of Mrs. Wong volunteering to help other elderly residents navigate social service systems, using her own experience to assist people facing similar challenges. The image captured the transformation from crime victim to community resource that represented one of the most positive outcomes possible in criminal justice work. Photographs from Mrs. Wong's case also documented the grocery store's participation in community outreach efforts, showing staff members trained to recognize signs of food insecurity and to connect struggling customers with appropriate resources. The images demonstrated how businesses could become partners in preventing crime by addressing underlying social problems. Detective Kim spent time examining photographs from the vandalism case at Roosevelt Elementary School, images that showed both the damage that had been inflicted and the community art project that had emerged from the resolution of the case. The photographs documented the transformation of destructive energy into creative expression that had benefited the entire school community. The series included photographs of Maria Santos working with students on the mural project that had replaced the eliminated art club, showing young people engaged in positive creative activities that provided alternatives to destructive expressions of frustration. The images captured the collaborative effort that had transformed a criminal incident into an opportunity for community building and artistic expression. One photograph showed the completed mural during its dedication ceremony, with students, parents, teachers, and community members gathered to celebrate the positive outcome that had emerged from what had initially appeared to be simple vandalism. The image demonstrated how thoughtful intervention could transform negative incidents into opportunities for community growth and healing. As Detective Kim continued his examination of the photographic archives, he was struck by how images captured aspects of police work that written reports could only approximate. The photographs revealed the human faces behind case numbers, the physical environments where crimes had occurred, and the emotional moments when cases were resolved and communities were restored to order. The photographic evidence documented not just criminal activities, but the full cycle of disruption and healing that characterized effective law enforcement. The images showed crime scenes being processed with scientific precision, evidence being carefully preserved and analyzed, suspects being treated with dignity during arrest and prosecution, and victims being supported through recovery and restoration. Detective Kim found that the photographs also captured the collaborative nature of police work, showing officers working together with prosecutors, social workers, community volunteers, and ordinary citizens to address problems that extended far beyond simple law enforcement issues. The images revealed how crime resolution required community-wide effort and how successful outcomes depended on cooperation among many different individuals and institutions. The archival photographs demonstrated the evolution of police techniques and technology over the decades, from the film photography and manual evidence processing of earlier eras to the digital imaging and computerized analysis systems that characterized contemporary investigations. Yet the images also revealed continuities in approach and values that transcended technological changes. Throughout all the photographs, Detective Kim could see evidence of the patience, thoroughness, and genuine concern for community welfare that had characterized effective police work across different eras and technological environments. The images documented investigations that had been conducted with scientific rigor, while also showing the human compassion that had guided interactions with victims, suspects, and community members. As he returned the storage boxes to their proper places in the climate-controlled archive, Detective Kim felt a deep appreciation for the visual record that these photographs provided of police work at its most thoughtful and effective. The images would remain preserved for future researchers and investigators who needed to understand how crimes had been solved and communities had been served by dedicated professionals committed to justice and public safety. The photography archives represented more than just evidence storage. They were repositories of institutional wisdom and community memory, preserving visual documentation of how societies responded to crime and conflict. The images held lessons about investigation techniques, community engagement, and the complex human circumstances that surrounded criminal activity. The basement archive around him continued its silent vigil over thousands of such images, each one preserving a moment of truth that had contributed to the resolution of human conflicts and the restoration of community order. The photographs rested in their protective storage, waiting for the next researcher who needed to understand how patient, methodical police work could transform chaos into comprehension and fear into security. Detective Sarah Chun walked slowly along Riverside Avenue as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows between buildings that had witnessed decades of human drama. This was her meditation route, a path through neighborhoods where she could observe how the city had absorbed and transformed the memories of crimes that had once disrupted its peaceful rhythms. Each street held stories that lived now only in archived reports and the gentle, collective memory of communities that had healed. From old wounds, the intersection of Riverside and Oak Street had once been the center of a drug-dealing operation that had plagued the neighborhood for months in the early 1990s. Detective Williams had spent countless hours conducting surveillance from various vantage points, documenting the patterns of activity that had eventually led to arrests and prosecutions that restored safety to the area. Now the intersection bustled with legitimate commerce. A coffee shop where elderly residents gathered for morning conversations. A small grocery store that served families who preferred walking to drive-in for daily necessities. And a bookstore that hosted reading groups and community meetings. The transformation represented one of the most satisfying aspects of long-term police work. The opportunity to see how patient law enforcement could help neighborhoods reclaim spaces that had been temporarily claimed by criminal activity. Detective Chun paused at the coffee shop, observing through the window as customers engaged in the comfortable interactions that characterized healthy community life. Mrs. Rodriguez, now in her 70s, still came here every morning, as she had for years since the drug dealers had been cleared from the corner. Her presence represented continuity and resilience, the way that ordinary citizens reclaimed their public spaces when Criminal threats were removed. The bookstore displayed a small historical exhibit about the neighborhood's development, including photographs from different eras that showed how the area had evolved over the decades. The exhibit made no mention of the drug dealing that had once occurred here, but Detective Chun appreciated how the display celebrated the community's positive history while acknowledging that all neighborhoods experienced challenges that required collective response and healing. She continued north on Riverside, passing the apartment building where Patricia Morrison had once lived during her embezzlement case. The building had been renovated in recent years, with improved landscaping and security features that suggested landlord investment in creating a safe and attractive environment for residents. Morrison herself had moved away after completing her sentence, but Detective Chun had heard that she had found employment in a different city and was successfully rebuilding her life. The apartment building now housed young families and elderly residents who had created a small community garden in the courtyard where Morrison had once sat alone, wrestling with the financial pressures that had eventually led her to commit crimes against her employer. The garden represented transformation and renewal, the way that spaces could be reclaimed for positive purposes when communities invested energy in creating environments that supported healthy relationships. Detective Chun walked past the elementary school where the vandalism incident had been transformed into an opportunity for artistic expression and community engagement. The school's exterior walls now featured multiple murals created by successive classes of students, working with professional artists and community volunteers. The original mural that had emerged from Maria Santos's community service had inspired an ongoing program that gave young people constructive outlets for creativity while beautifying the school environment. The school's main entrance displayed a plaque dedicating the mural program to the memory of Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, the elderly woman whose temporary disappearance had led to such an intensive community search effort. Mrs. Hoffman had been particularly supportive of educational programs during her final years, and the memorial reflected her belief that communities grew stronger when they invested in young people's development and creative expression. Detective Chun could see students working on a new mural section during their after-school art program, their voices carrying across the playground as they discussed color choices and design elements with the patient guidance of their teacher. The scene represented one of the most positive outcomes of police work, the creation of programs and opportunities that addressed underlying causes of youth crime while providing young people with meaningful ways to contribute to their communities. She continued toward the downtown business district, where many of the establishments had been affected by various crimes over the years, but had persevered and adapted to create a thriving commercial area that served residents throughout the city. The pawn shop where Detective Park had discovered the stolen silver spoons now operated under new ownership, with enhanced security procedures and community partnerships that helped prevent the sale of stolen merchandise while maintaining legitimate business operations. Shop's new owner had implemented a program that worked with local police to identify potentially stolen items while also providing services to community members who needed short-term financial assistance. The approach balanced business needs with community safety concerns, demonstrating how enterprises could operate profitably while also supporting law enforcement efforts to prevent crime. Detective Chun passed the bank where Thomas Rodriguez had once worked before his involvement in check fraud had led to criminal charges and imprisonment. The bank had been acquired by a larger institution several years earlier, but it continued to serve the community while implementing enhanced security measures and employee training programs that helped prevent internal theft and fraud. Building now housed a community financial literacy program that provided education about budgeting, saving, and avoiding financial scams that particularly affected elderly residents and recent immigrants. The program had emerged from community recognition that financial education could help prevent both crime victimization and the financial desperation that sometimes motivated people to commit crimes against their employers or neighbors. She walked through Riverside Park, where Timothy Walsh had once played as a child before his abduction, and where he now brought his own children to enjoy the playground equipment and open spaces that had been enhanced over the years with improved lighting, security features, and programming that encouraged family use during evening hours. The park contained several memorials to community members who had contributed to neighborhood safety and well-being over the years. The bench dedicated to Mrs. Hoffman remained a popular gathering place for elderly residents who appreciated having a comfortable spot to rest during their daily walks while observing the activities of families and children who used the park's recreational facilities. Detective Chun sat on Mrs. Hoffman's memorial bench for a few minutes, watching as parents supervised children on the playground equipment while older children played pickup games on the basketball court that had been added as part of recent park improvements. The scene represented the ultimate goal of all police work: public spaces where people felt safe enough to engage in normal recreational activities without constant concern about potential dangers. The park's walking paths now included exercise stations and interpretive signs about local wildlife and history, creating educational opportunities that encouraged residents to spend time outdoors while learning about their community's natural and cultural heritage. The improvements had been funded through a combination of city resources and community fundraising efforts that demonstrated residents' commitment to maintaining and enhancing their shared public spaces. Detective Chun left the park and walked toward the historic district, where Marcus Chun's theft of architectural elements had once threatened the integrity of 19th century buildings that represented important aspects of the community's cultural heritage. The affected buildings had been restored using insurance settlements and community preservation funds, with enhanced security measures that protected valuable architectural features while maintaining public access to historically significant structures. The preservation efforts had led to the establishment of a historic district walking tour that educated visitors about local architecture and history, while generating modest revenue that supported ongoing maintenance and security efforts. The tour included information about the challenges of preserving historic buildings in urban environments, including the need to balance public access with protection from theft and vandalism. Several of the historic buildings now house small businesses and artist studios that contributed to the area's economic vitality while respecting the architectural character that made the district unique. The businesses had formed an association that coordinated security efforts and shared information about suspicious activities that might threaten their properties or those of their neighbors. Detective Chen walked past the courthouse where many of the cases she had studied in the archives had been resolved through legal proceedings that balanced accountability with compassion. The courthouse steps had been refurbished in recent years, with improved accessibility features and landscaping that created a more welcoming environment for citizens who needed to conduct business with the judicial system. The courthouse now hosted educational programs that helped community members understand how the legal system operated and how they could participate effectively as witnesses, jurors, or advocates for various causes. The programs had grown from recognition that an informed citizenry was essential for maintaining effective democratic institutions and ensuring that justice remained accessible to all community members. She continued to the Westfield Mall, where Detective Martinez's patient work had once solved a series of car break-ins while also implementing crime prevention. Measures that had made the shopping center a safer environment for customers and employees. The mall had evolved over the years, with some stores closing and others opening in response to changing consumer preferences and economic conditions. The parking lot security measures that had emerged from the original investigation had been updated with modern technology, including improved lighting, surveillance cameras, and communication systems that allowed rapid response to incidents when they occurred. The mall management had also implemented customer education programs that helped shoppers protect their vehicles and personal property while visiting commercial areas. The mall's community liaison office had expanded to provide information about various social services and resources available to residents throughout the region. The office served as a connection point between commercial and social service sectors, helping ensure that people facing various challenges could access appropriate assistance while also contributing to overall community safety and well-being. Detective Chen walked through the neighborhood where Mrs. Wang had once lived before her financial difficulties had led her to shoplift food from the local grocery store. The area had benefited from enhanced social services and community support programs that helped elderly residents maintain their independence while ensuring access to adequate nutrition, healthcare, and social interaction. The grocery store where Mrs. Wang had been caught shoplifting had become a model for how businesses could partner with social service agencies to address underlying causes of crime while maintaining security and profitability. The store's approach included employee training about recognizing customers who might be experiencing food insecurity and connecting them with appropriate resources before desperation led to criminal behavior. The neighborhood now hosted a weekly farmers market that provided fresh produce at reduced prices while creating opportunities for social interaction among residents who might otherwise experience isolation. The market had emerged from community recognition that food access and social connection were essential components of public safety and community health. Detective Chen continued to the area where Robert Chun had once operated his art theft and laundering network, using legitimate gallery spaces and auction house connections to dispose of stolen artwork throughout the region. The galleries that had been unknowingly involved in the scheme had implemented enhanced provenance verification procedures that helped prevent the sale of stolen art while maintaining their roles as important cultural institutions. The art district had grown over the years to include additional galleries, artist studios, and cultural organizations that contributed to the community's creative vitality while also generating economic activity that supported local businesses and property values. The district had become a model for how cultural development could contribute to neighborhood revitalization and crime prevention. Several of the galleries now hosted educational programs about art history, conservation, and the legitimate art market, helping community members develop appreciation for visual arts while also understanding the importance of protecting cultural heritage from theft and exploitation. The programs had been particularly popular with students and elderly residents who enjoyed learning about artistic techniques and cultural traditions. Detective Chun walked toward the library where Professor Whitfield had once stolen rare books and manuscripts for personal financial gain. The library had rebuilt its rare book collection using insurance funds and donations from community members who valued having access to historical materials for research and educational purposes. The library's rare book room now operated with enhanced security measures and access controls that protected valuable materials while maintaining availability to legitimate researchers and scholars. The room included educational displays that helped visitors understand the importance of preserving historical documents, and the challenges involved in maintaining collections that served both current and future generations. Professor Whitfield's community service work at the library had evolved into ongoing volunteer activities that contributed to cataloging and preservation efforts while also providing educational programs for community members interested in local history and genealogical research. His experience had demonstrated how criminal justice outcomes could include genuine rehabilitation and positive community contribution. As evening approached, Detective Chun made her way back toward the police station, walking through neighborhoods where the accumulated effects of decades of patient police work had created environments where families could live without constant fear and where businesses could operate without excessive security concerns. The streets she walked held memories of all the cases she had studied in the archives, but those memories had been transformed by time and healing into foundations for stronger communities. The crimes that had once disrupted neighborhood life had been resolved through legal processes that balanced accountability with compassion, creating outcomes that served both justice and community well-being. Detective Chen reflected on how the city itself had become a kind of archive, where the physical spaces held stories of challenges overcome and problems solved through the patient application of law enforcement, social services, and community engagement. The buildings, streets, and public spaces had absorbed these experiences and transformed them into the foundation for ongoing community life. The transformation was visible in small details: the comfortable interaction between elderly residents and young families, the way that public spaces were used for positive recreational and social activities, the presence of small businesses that served neighborhood needs while contributing to local economic vitality. These signs of community health represented the ultimate measure of successful police work. As darkness settled over the city, Detective Chun could see lights coming on in windows that suggested families gathering for evening meals, children completing homework, adults discussing the events of their days. The scenes represented the ordinary domestic life that police work existed to protect and preserve, the foundation of civilized society that required constant vigilance but also constant compassion. The city around her continued its evening rhythms, with people heading home from work, students walking back from libraries and study groups, elderly residents taking final walks before settling in for the night. The normal flow of activity suggested that residents felt safe in their environment and confident that help was available if problems arose. Detective Chun arrived at the police station as the day shift was ending and the night shift was beginning. The transition that marked the continuous nature of law enforcement and the commitment to maintaining community safety around the clock. The building represented not just a workplace, but a symbol of society's dedication to protecting individual rights and maintaining social order through patient, professional service. The station's lights created pools of illumination in the gathering darkness, visible reminders that the machinery of justice continued to operate even when most citizens were resting in their homes. The building held all the archived cases that Detective Chun had studied, preserving institutional memory that would guide future investigations and help maintain the standards of professionalism that characterized effective law enforcement. As she entered the building, Detective Chun carried with her the knowledge that the city outside represented more than just a collection of streets and buildings. It was a living archive of human experience, where the patient work of law enforcement had helped transform individual incidents of crime and conflict into opportunities for community growth and strengthening. The archives inside the building preserved the detailed documentation of how this transformation had occurred, while the city itself demonstrated the lasting effects of police work that extended beyond immediate crime solving to encompass genuine service to community welfare and social justice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to continue this essential work of maintaining the balance between individual freedom and collective security that made civilized life possible.